July 29th, 1852. The humid air of Hawkins County, Tennessee hung heavy over the timber-framed farmhouse where Commodore Perry Owens first entered the world. He was named after the naval hero of the War of 1812, a legacy of martial pride that contrasted with the grinding poverty of his immediate surroundings. His father, Oliver Perry Owens, was a man whose hands were permanently stained by the red clay of the Appalachian foothills, and whose temperament was as rigid as the rocky soil he tried to cultivate. Jane Humphreys, his mother, managed a household defined by the constant threat of scarcity and the unyielding demands of survival in the antebellum South. The floorboards of their modest dwelling were worn smooth by the frantic movements of a family struggling to stay ahead of debt and hunger. From his earliest moments, Commodore was immersed in an environment where silence was a survival trait, and physical labor was the only recognized currency of worth. The landscape of eastern Tennessee offered little in the way of comfort for a growing boy. The terrain was a vertical maze of limestone ridges and dense thickets of oak and hickory that boxed in the small clearings used for corn and tobacco. By the time Commodore was old enough to carry a bucket, he was integrated into the relentless cycle of the farm. He spent his days hauling water from distant springs and clearing stones from fields that seemed to sprout new rocks every time it rained. The physical toll of this work manifested in his lean, wiry frame and a permanent callus on his palms before he reached his 10th year. He learned to navigate the woods with a quietness that bordered on the unnatural, moving through the undergrowth without snapping twigs or disturbing the local fauna. This early isolation shaped a mind that preferred the predictable mechanics of nature to the volatile emotions of human interaction. Domestic life was dominated by the stern presence of Oliver, who viewed any sign of leisure as a moral failing. The elder Owens believed in the corrective power of the lash and the necessity of absolute obedience. Commodore developed a stoic exterior as a defense mechanism against his father's frequent outbursts of frustration. When the plow broke or a mule went lame, the consequences were often visited upon the boy's back. This constant threat of violence did not break him, but rather forged a shell of emotional detachment that would define his later years as a lawman. He retreated into the woods whenever possible, finding a sense of control in the wilderness that was absent in the family home. In the forest, he was not a subordinate to be corrected, but a predator learning the movements of his prey. The outbreak of the Civil War in 1861 brought a new layer of tension to the region. Tennessee was a fractured state, with East Tennessee remaining a pocket of Union sentiment surrounded by Confederate authority. The Owens family found themselves in a no-man's land where roving bands of irregulars and official conscription parties made every day a gamble. Commodore witnessed the brutality of partisan warfare firsthand as neighbors turned against neighbors over political loyalties. He saw smoke on the horizon from burning barns and heard the distant thunder of skirmishes that never made the history books. These experiences stripped away any illusions he might have had about the sanctity of life or the reliability of the law. He understood early that power resided in the man who could strike first and strike with the most precision. Economic collapse followed the footsteps of the armies, and by 1863 the Owens farm was no longer sustainable. The family joined the westward migration of displaced Southerners, seeking a new start in the more stable environment of Indiana. They settled in Hendricks County, a place where the flat, fertile plains offered a stark contrast to the vertical world of Tennessee. The transition did not ease the friction between Commodore and his father. If anything, the move intensified Oliver's drive to succeed, leading to even greater demands on his son's labor. Commodore found Indiana to be a landscape of endless rows of crops and stifling social expectations. The relative safety of the Midwest felt like a cage to a youth who had already seen the raw edges of a society in collapse. In Indiana, Commodore's fascination with firearms began to take a professional turn. While other boys his age were interested in social gatherings or local festivities, he spent every spare cent he could scavenge on percussion caps and black powder. He acquired a discarded rifle and began a systematic study of its mechanics. He did not just practice shooting. He analyzed the arc of the projectile and the impact of windage on a heavy slug. He would spend hours in the back woodlots, firing at targets from varying distances until the motion of loading and aiming became an instinctual extension of his body. His eyes, even then described as piercing and unblinking, became adept at spotting the slightest movement in the brush. He discovered that while he could not control his father's temper, he could control exactly where a piece of metal landed at 100 yards. His relationship with his father reached a terminal point in the late 1860s. Oliver's demands for total submission collided with Commodore's growing need for autonomy. The tension within the household became a palpable thing, a heavy pressure that made every meal a trial of endurance. Commodore was now a young man with a man's strength, and he no longer accepted the physical corrections that had defined his childhood. The final break was not a single explosive event, but a cold realization that he could no longer breathe in the atmosphere of his father's house. He packed a few belongings, took his rifle, and walked away from the Hendricks County farm without looking back. He left behind the expectations of a settled life for the uncertainty of the frontier, driven by a deep-seated need for a space where his silence would not be mistaken for weakness. He drifted through the borderlands, taking odd jobs that kept him on the fringes of society. He worked as a farmhand, a teamster, and a laborer, never staying in one place long enough to form lasting bonds. This period of wandering was a continuation of his education in survival. He learned to read the character of men in the saloons and boarding houses of the expanding West. He saw the transition from the organized agriculture of the Midwest to the chaotic, opportunistic world of the territories. He observed that the loudest men were often the first to fold under pressure, while those who spoke the least were the ones to be feared. This observation reinforced his natural inclination toward reclusion. He maintained his equipment with a meticulous care that bordered on the obsessive, ensuring his rifle was always clean and his boots were always greased. The environment of the high plains in the early 1870s was a crucible for a man of his temperament. He found work in the cattle industry, which was then pushing into the grasslands of the Indian Territory and southern Kansas. The life of a cowboy was one of extreme physical hardship, consisting of 20-hour days in the saddle and nights spent on the cold ground. Commodore thrived in this setting. The lack of social nuance suited him, and his ability to handle a long gun made him a valuable asset for protecting herds from both animal and human predators. He did not seek out conflict, but he did not shy away from it when it threatened the property he was paid to guard. His reputation as a man who could be relied upon in a crisis began to take shape among the rough crews of the cattle trails. During these years, his physical appearance began to diverge from the standard rugged look of the frontier laborer. He started to grow his hair long, a habit that some attributed to vanity but which he claimed was a practical measure against the elements. He took pride in his clothes, keeping them as neat as the conditions allowed. This attention to detail earned him the nickname of a dandy, a term usually reserved for town-dwelling fops. However, those who used the term with derision quickly learned to temper their mockery when they saw him handle a firearm. The contrast between his polished exterior and his lethal capabilities created an aura of unpredictability. He was a man who looked like he belonged in a parlor but acted like he belonged in a war zone. His time in the Indian Territory exposed him to the complexities of land disputes and the shifting boundaries between indigenous territories and white settlement. He saw the law used as a tool for dispossession and witnessed the desperation of those caught in the middle of these territorial shifts. He began to develop a personal code that was less about the letter of the law and more about a rigid sense of territorial integrity. If a man had a right to a piece of ground or a head of cattle, Commodore believed that right should be defended with absolute force. He had no patience for the negotiations or compromises that defined civil society. To him, the world was a collection of clear lines that should never be crossed. By 1873, he was moving toward New Mexico, a region where the law was often just a suggestion. The territory was a patchwork of mining camps, sprawling ranches, and isolated settlements where the nearest sheriff might be several days' ride away. Commodore found this lack of formal structure appealing. He took a job as a buffalo hunter, a profession that required long periods of solitude and the ability to kill from great distances. The slaughter of the great herds was a brutal industrial process, and Commodore approached it with his typical mechanical efficiency. He would set up his stand and methodically drop animals one by one, his rifle barrel growing hot as he decimated the herd. The work was bloody and smelled of rot and gunpowder, but it provided him with the financial independence he craved. The life of a buffalo hunter was dangerous not just because of the environment, but because of the constant threat of conflict with the tribes who relied on the buffalo for survival. Commodore had several close calls where his ability to hit a moving target at long range was the only thing that kept him from being overrun. He learned to sleep with one eye open and to interpret the subtle changes in the wind that signaled the approach of a stranger. These years in the wilderness stripped away the last remnants of his Midwestern upbringing. He became a creature of the high desert, his skin bronzed by the sun and his eyes perpetually squinted against the glare. He was a man who had completely severed his ties to his past and was now fully integrated into the harsh reality of the frontier. Despite his solitary nature, he occasionally sought out the company of other hunters and trappers. These interactions were always brief and transactional. He was known as a man who would share his fire but not his thoughts. He avoided the heavy drinking and gambling that consumed the wages of most men in his position. He preferred to spend his evenings maintaining his gear or studying the topography of the land. He mapped out the locations of waterholes and defensible ridges in his mind, treating the entire territory as a giant chessboard where he was a permanent player. This strategic mindset would later serve him well when he traded his hunter's rifle for a sheriff's badge. The year 1873 marked a shift in his trajectory as he moved deeper into the Southwest. He was no longer just a drifter or a laborer. He was a man with a specific set of skills that were in high demand. His ability to navigate the desert, his legendary marksmanship, and his unflinching composure under fire made him a prime candidate for roles that required both courage and lethality. He was beginning to realize that the skills he had developed to escape his father's house were the very things that could give him power in this new world. He was moving toward a collision with the organized lawlessness of the Arizona Territory, a place that would eventually make his name synonymous with a specific kind of cold-blooded justice. As he crossed the border into the regions that would eventually become his domain, Commodore Perry Owens was a finished product. The boy from Hawkins County who had been shaped by the lash and the plow was gone. In his place was a man who valued precision over emotion and results over rhetoric. He carried with him a Winchester rifle that he treated with more affection than any human being he had ever met. He was a man who had been forged in the fire of domestic conflict and tempered in the ice of the high plains. He was ready for the violence that was coming, and he was prepared to meet it with a level of detachment that would terrify his enemies and unsettle his allies. The final days of his youth were spent in the transition between the life of a hunter and the life of a guardian. He saw the coming of the railroads and the arrival of the large cattle companies, and he understood that the era of the individual drifter was ending. He recognized that the only way to maintain his independence in this changing landscape was to align himself with the forces of order, however flawed they might be. He began to look for opportunities where his particular brand of efficiency could be utilized on a larger scale. He was looking for a territory that was wild enough to need him but structured enough to pay him. He found that territory in the sun-scorched reaches of northern Arizona. His arrival in the region was not marked by fanfare or grand announcements. He simply appeared, a long-haired man with a distinctive rifle and a gaze that seemed to look through people rather than at them. He took work where he could find it, gradually building a reputation among the locals as someone who didn't talk much but never missed a shot. The stories of his accuracy began to circulate in the saloons of towns like Flagstaff and Holbrook. Men spoke of him hitting coins tossed in the air or dropping coyotes at distances that seemed impossible to the average shooter. These stories were the first threads of the legend that would eventually grow around him. A legend that he did nothing to discourage but also nothing to promote. In these early Arizona years, he witnessed the escalating violence between the various factions vying for control of the land. He saw the rustlers, the horse thieves, and the gunmen who operated with impunity because the law was too far away or too frightened to intervene. He watched as honest settlers were intimidated and robbed, their livelihoods destroyed by men who saw the lack of order as an invitation to chaos. This triggered a response in Commodore that reached back to his childhood. He had a visceral hatred for bullies and those who used physical superior force to dominate others. He saw the outlaws of Arizona as extensions of his father's temper, and he felt a growing impulse to exert a different kind of force against them. The transition from a man who protected himself to a man who protected a community was a gradual one. It started with small acts of intervention. A stolen horse recovered here, a group of harassers chased off there. Each incident reinforced his belief that the only thing these predators respected was the threat of immediate lethal consequence. He didn't believe in rehabilitation or the nuances of the legal system. To him, an outlaw was a malfunctioning part of the social machine that needed to be removed. His approach was clinical and devoid of the theatricality that many Western gunmen employed. He didn't draw fast, he simply shot straight, and didn't stop until the threat was neutralized. By the mid-1870s, he was working for the major ranching interests in the area. These companies needed men who could stand their ground against organized gangs of rustlers. Commodore was perfectly suited for this role. He would spend weeks alone in the outlying ranges, living off the land and keeping a silent watch over the herds. He became a ghost in the landscape, a presence that the outlaws knew was out there but could never quite pin down. His effectiveness in this role made him a local celebrity among the law-abiding citizens and a target for the criminal element. He didn't care about either status. He was content as long as he had his rifle, his horse, and the autonomy to act as he saw fit. The environment he inhabited was one of extreme physical reality. The desert was not a backdrop. It was an active participant in his daily life. The heat was a constant weight, and the dust was a permanent grit in his teeth and clothes. He learned to appreciate the brutality of the landscape, seeing it as an honest reflection of the human condition. There was no room for poetry in a place where a missed waterhole meant death, and a jammed rifle meant a shallow grave. He embraced this lack of sentimentality, allowing it to permeate every aspect of his existence. He was a man of the earth and the gun, two things that never lied and never failed if handled correctly. As the decade drew to a close, the political and social pressures in Apache County were reaching a boiling point. The influx of new settlers and the expansion of the sheep and cattle industries created a volatile mix of interests. The existing law enforcement was seen as either corrupt or incompetent, unable to stem the tide of violence that was beginning to define the region. The citizens were looking for someone who could bring order to the chaos, someone who was not tied to any of the local factions, and who had the stomach for the necessary violence. Commodore Perry Owens, with his long hair, his dandy clothes, and his terrifying proficiency with a Winchester, was the man they were waiting for. His decision to eventually run for sheriff was not born of political ambition. He didn't care about the prestige of the office or the power it yielded over the townspeople. He saw it as a logical extension of the work he was already doing. It was a way to bring his brand of territorial defense to a larger stage. He understood that the badge would give him a legal shield for the actions he was already inclined to take. It would turn his solitary warfare into a sanctioned campaign of purification. He was ready to take on the responsibility of the office because he knew that he was the only one in the county who wasn't afraid of the men who needed to be killed. The boy who had walked away from the Indiana farm had finally found his purpose. The years of wandering, hunting, and guarding had been a long apprenticeship for the role he was about to play. He had mastered the art of survival in a world that wanted him dead, and he had learned to wield lethality with the precision of a surgeon. As he looked toward the future in Apache County, he do so with a cold, unwavering focus. He knew that his time as a dandy sheriff would be defined by blood, and he was more than willing to pay that price to establish the kind of order he believed in. April 10th, 1873. The morning sun broke over the jagged horizon of the Indian Territory, casting long, distorted shadows across the scrub brush and red dirt, where Commodore Perry Owens adjusted the cinch on his saddle. He had successfully transitioned from the stifling humidity of the east to the arid, high-altitude expanses of the western frontier, carrying nothing but a sparse kit and a growing mastery over his chosen tools. The air here was thin and sharp, carrying the scent of dry sage and distant rain that never quite reached the parched earth. Commodore moved with a deliberate slowness, a habit formed by the necessity of conserving energy in an environment that offered no margin for error. He was no longer a runaway farm boy, but a man whose physical presence was beginning to mirror the harshness of the terrain he navigated. His long hair, already a signature trait, served as a functional shield against the biting wind and the relentless glare of the sun. The transition into the heart of the territory required a complete recalibration of his senses. In the woods of Tennessee, sound was muffled by the canopy, but in the open plains, noise carried for miles and silence was often more indicative of danger than a physical threat. Commodore spent his early days in the territory working for various cattle outfits, filling the role of a line rider. This job demanded a high degree of self-reliance, as it involved spending weeks away from the main camp, patrolling the porous borders of the range to prevent cattle from drifting into the Badlands. He lived out of a bedroll, cooking sparse meals over small fires fueled by dried dung or scraps of mesquite. This isolation was not a burden for him. It was a sanctuary where he could refine his observations of the natural world without the distraction of human chatter. He watched the way the wind bent the grass and the way the birds circled, learning to read the environment like a map of potential conflict. The Indian Territory in the early 1870s was a chaotic landscape of overlapping jurisdictions and lawless voids. It was a place where the displacement of indigenous tribes intersected with the arrival of desperate men looking for a fresh start or a place to hide. Commodore witnessed the brutal reality of this displacement, seeing the remnants of once powerful nations relegated to desolate tracts of land. He did not view these events through a lens of political ideology, but as a witness to the raw exercise of power. He saw that the frontier was being shaped by the Winchester and the Colt, and he dedicated himself to becoming the most proficient user of those instruments. He would spend his midday breaks practicing his draw and his aim, focusing on the mechanical interaction between the hammer, the sear, and the primer. He understood that in a confrontation, the man who hesitated to calculate his chances was already dead. His first significant encounter with the criminal element of the territory occurred near the Cimarron River. A group of 3 men, their horses lathered and their clothes caked in the dust of a hard ride, approached his small camp just before dusk. They didn't offer a greeting, and their hands remained dangerously close to the grips of their revolvers. Commodore did not rise from his position by the fire, but his rifle lay across his knees, the muzzle angled toward the lead rider's chest. The tension in the air was palpable, a physical weight that made the crackling of the fire sound like a gunshot. The men demanded his supplies, assuming the solitary drifter would be an easy mark. Commodore didn't engage in an argument. He simply shifted the rifle slightly, and the clicking of the lever action mechanism served as his only response. The men, recognizing the cold lack of fear in his unblinking eyes, chose to ride on, leaving him alone in the growing darkness. This incident reinforced his belief that the appearance of weakness was an invitation to violence. He began to pay even closer attention to his gear, ensuring that his weapons were always in a state of absolute readiness. He replaced the factory sights on his rifle with custom-filed notches that allowed for a more precise alignment at long distances. He practiced shooting from various positions, prone, kneeling, and from the saddle, until he could hit a target with the same consistency regardless of his physical orientation. He was not interested in the flashy gunplay of the dime novels. He wanted the mechanical certainty of a marksman. He viewed his rifle as an extension of his will, a tool designed to enforce a perimeter of safety around his person. By 1874, he had moved into the panhandle of Texas, a region dominated by the great buffalo herds and the hunters who followed them. The scale of the slaughter was immense, an industrial-scale destruction that turned the plains into a charnel house. Commodore took a job with a hunting party, not out of a desire for the kill, but for the wages and the opportunity to test his skills against larger targets. The work was grueling and filthy. He spent his days in a stand, a stationary position from which he would methodically drop buffalo one by one. The heavy slugs from his Sharps rifle would strike with a dull thud, and the animals would collapse in their tracks, often without alerting the rest of the herd. The air was thick with the smell of iron and decay, a sensory overload that would have broken a more sensitive man. But Commodore processed it with a clinical detachment. The buffalo camps were magnets for the worst elements of the frontier: thieves, gamblers, and men fleeing from justice in the East. Violence was the primary method of dispute resolution, and the lack of any formal law meant that every man was his own judge and executioner. Commodore kept to the fringes of these camps, avoiding the whiskey-soaked brawls and the high-stakes card games that inevitably ended in bloodshed. He was known among the hunters as a man who did his work with a grim efficiency and kept his mouth shut. He didn't participate in the boasting or the exaggerated tales of prowess that were common around the evening fires. His actions spoke for him, and the pile of hides at the end of each day was the only testimony he required. One afternoon, while tracking a stray calf that had wandered into a series of limestone breaks, he came across a group of rustlers who were in the process of rebranding cattle stolen from a nearby ranch. There were 4 of them, and they were confident in their seclusion. Commodore did not announce his presence. He positioned himself on a ridge overlooking the branding fire and waited. He didn't feel the surge of adrenaline that most men experience in the face of conflict. He felt a sharpening of focus. He watched them work for an hour, memorizing their faces and the markings on their horses. When one of the men looked up and spotted the sun reflecting off Commodore's rifle barrel, the situation shifted instantly. Commodore fired a single shot that struck the branding iron out of the man's hand, the impact sending sparks and hot embers into the dry grass. He didn't follow up with a lethal shot. He simply remained on the ridge, a silent, long-haired specter of retribution. The rustlers fled, leaving the cattle and their equipment behind. This event solidified his reputation as a man who could not be intimidated. Word of the dandy marksman who guarded his territory with a cold, almost supernatural precision began to spread among the ranches of the Texas Panhandle and eastern New Mexico. He was hired by the larger outfits to act as a range detective, a precursor to his later role as a sheriff. This job involved hunting down horse thieves and cattle rustlers in the most remote corners of the territory. It was a lonely and dangerous existence, requiring him to live off the air and the water he could find in the desert. He became an expert tracker, learning to distinguish between the gait of a riderless horse and one carrying a man, and how to read the age of a track by the way the moisture had evaporated from the turned soil. The physical environment of New Mexico offered a new set of challenges. The high desert landscape was a maze of deep canyons and volcanic ridges that could hide a man or an entire army. The heat in the summer was a physical blow, and the winters brought sudden lethal blizzards that could bury a camp in hours. Commodore adapted by shedding any gear that was not essential for survival. He learned to survive on jerky and parched corn and to find water in the most unlikely places. The roots of certain plants or hidden seeps in the canyon walls. His body became as lean and tough as the mesquite wood, and his eyes took on a permanent squint from years of scanning the bright horizon. He was a man who had been completely integrated into the mechanics of the wilderness. In 1875, he spent several months in the mining districts near Silver City. The mining camps were even more volatile than the cattle towns, populated by men driven by the desperation of the gold fever. Here, Commodore saw the fragility of the social contract. He saw men who had been friends for years kill each other over a few inches of dirt. He worked as a guard for the silver shipments, a job that required him to sit on the box of a stagecoach with his Winchester across his lap. He never had to fire a shot during these runs. His mere presence, combined with the stories of his lethality, was enough to discourage most would-be robbers. The outlaws knew that Commodore Owens didn't miss, and they weren't willing to bet their lives on a gamble they were likely to lose. His interactions with the law during this period were infrequent and usually negative. The territorial marshals and local sheriffs were often more interested in collecting fees or serving political interests than in maintaining order. Commodore saw that the badge was often used as a license for extortion, and he developed a deep skepticism of formal authority. He believed that true justice was a personal responsibility, not something that could be delegated to a corrupt bureaucracy. This belief system would later make him a difficult man to manage once he took the badge himself. He didn't answer to a political party or a social circle. He answered to his own rigid code of conduct. The year 1876 brought him back to the cattle ranges, this time in the employment of the Aztec Land and Cattle Company, better known as the Hash Knife Outfit. This was one of the largest and most powerful ranching operations in the Southwest, and it was plagued by organized groups of rustlers who operated with near total impunity. Commodore was brought in to provide a level of security that the local law could not or would not provide. He was given a wide mandate to do whatever was necessary to protect the company's interests. He spent his days and nights in the saddle, patrolling the vast reaches of the Arizona and New Mexico border. He became a terror to the rustlers, appearing out of the dust when they least expected him and disappearing just as quickly once the work was done. During his time with the Hash Knife, he developed a specific method of operation. He didn't ride in with a posse. He worked alone. He believed that a single man could move more quietly and effectively than a group. He would track a group of outlaws for days, staying just out of sight and waiting for the moment when they were most vulnerable. He would then strike with a suddenness that left them no time to react. He didn't care about making arrests. He cared about making sure the rustling stopped. If a man surrendered, Commodore would turn him over to the authorities, but if a man reached for a gun, Commodore made sure he never reached for anything else again. The casualty count among the rustlers began to climb, and the name Commodore Perry Owens became a curse in the outlaw camps. His physical appearance during this time was a source of constant comment. He wore high-topped boots that were always polished, and his clothes were of a finer quality than what was typically seen on the range. He wore 2 revolvers in holsters that were positioned for a cross-draw, and he always carried his Winchester. His hair flowed down his back in long, dark waves, and he spent a significant amount of time grooming it. This juxtaposition of the dandy and the killer created a psychological advantage. His enemies couldn't reconcile his refined appearance with his brutal efficiency, and this confusion often gave Commodore the split-second advantage he needed to prevail in a confrontation. He was a man who understood the power of image long before it became a tool of modern celebrity. The brutality of his work was not something he ever discussed. He viewed the violence as a mechanical necessity, no different from branding a calf or digging a well. He saw the outlaws as parasites that were draining the life out of the territory, and he saw himself as the cure. He didn't feel a sense of triumph when he took a life. He felt a sense of completion. The job was done, the threat was neutralized, and the order of the world was restored. This lack of emotional involvement was perhaps his most terrifying trait. He was not a man driven by rage or revenge. He was a man driven by a cold, unwavering commitment to a specific outcome. In 1877, he was involved in a running gunfight with a group of horse thieves near the Chuska Mountains. The thieves had taken refuge in a series of ancient ruins, using the thick stone walls as cover. Commodore did not charge the position. He sat back at a distance that was well beyond the range of their revolvers and systematically began to fire his rifle into the openings of the ruins. He wasn't trying to hit the men directly. He was forcing them to stay down while he moved into a better position. After 3 hours of this psychological warfare, the thieves surrendered. They had realized that they were fighting a man who had all the time in the world and the skill to use every second of it to their disadvantage. The environment of the Chuska Mountains was a stark contrast to the flat plains of Texas. The high-altitude forests of ponderosa pine and the deep, shadowed canyons provided a different kind of cover and a different set of hazards. Commodore learned to move through the timber without making a sound, using the natural contours of the land to mask his approach. He became as adept at mountain warfare as he was at desert survival. He was becoming a universal soldier of the frontier, capable of operating in any terrain and against any odds. His reputation was no longer localized. It was becoming a part of the lore of the entire Southwest. As 1878 approached, the Arizona Territory were reaching a breaking point. The Lincoln County War in New Mexico had shown how quickly cattle disputes could escalate into full-scale paramilitary conflict. Commodore watched these events from a distance, recognizing the patterns of violence and the failures of leadership that allowed them to occur. He saw that the key to maintaining order was a single, strong individual who was not beholden to any faction. He began to see himself as that individual. He was tired of working for companies and individuals. He wanted the authority to act on behalf of the community as a whole. His time as a drifter and a range detective was coming to an end. He had spent a decade in the crucible of the frontier, and he had emerged as a man of singular purpose and unmatched skill. He had seen the best and worst of humanity in the most extreme conditions, and he had never wavered in his commitment to his own code. He was ready for the next phase of his life, a phase that would take him to the town of Holbrook and the sheriff's office of Apache County. He was ready to trade his anonymity for a badge, and his solitary patrols for a public campaign against the forces of chaos. The transition would not be easy. The political landscape of Apache County was a minefield of conflicting interests, and Commodore's eccentricities would make him an easy target for his detractors. But he didn't care about politics, and he didn't care about what people thought of his hair or his clothes. He knew that when the bullets started flying, the only thing that would matter was who could shoot the straightest and who could stand their ground the longest. He was confident that he was that man. He looked toward the future with the same unblinking gaze that had terrified the rustlers on the Cimarron, ready for the violence and the glory that awaited him in the high desert of Arizona. The final days of 1879 saw him settling into the region that would become his home for the next decade. He was no longer a stranger to the land. He was a part of it. He had learned its secrets and mastered its dangers. He was Commodore Perry Owens, the dandy sheriff in waiting, and the outlaws of Apache County had no idea what was coming for them. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would define the history of the Old West, and Commodore was already in position, his rifle clean, his boots polished, and his mind as cold and sharp as a winter morning in the mountains. He was the end of an era and the beginning of a new kind of law, a law written in the dirt and sealed with a Winchester, June 15th, 1881. The white crust of alkali deposits crunched under the boots of Commodore Perry Owens as he paced the perimeter of the watering hole at Navajo Springs. This remote station in northeastern Arizona sat as a vital, lonely artery for the stagecoach lines and the massive herds of the James D. Hawk Ranch. The water bubbled from the earth, a rare mineral-heavy liquid that sustained life in a landscape otherwise defined by dehydration and dust. Owens had accepted the position of foreman and range guard for Guthrie, a role that demanded he become the primary barrier between the ranch's assets and the predatory forces circulating through the territory. The horizon was a flat, shimmering plain of heat where the sky met the desert in a blurred line of purple and tan. Here, the silence was a physical presence, broken only by the occasional restless shift of a horse or the dry rattle of wind through the sagebrush. The Guthrie ranching operation relied on the accessibility of these springs, making the location a constant target for those who lived by theft. Commodore understood that his presence was the only factor preventing the total loss of the livestock under his care. He constructed a small, functional shelter that allowed him a clear view of the approaches from all cardinal directions. His daily routine was a study in mechanical consistency. He woke before the sun, utilizing the gray light of dawn to inspect the ground for new tracks. He possessed an ability to differentiate between the prints of a wild Mustang and those of a shod horse carrying the weight of a rider. Each evening, he spent an hour in the repetitive motion of cleaning his Winchester rifle, ensuring that the internal springs and the firing pin were free of the pervasive grit that could cause a jam in a critical moment. The threat of Navajo raiders was a constant reality during this period of the 1880s. These groups were not driven by malice but by the necessity of survival in a changing world where their traditional hunting grounds were being fenced and claimed. They moved with a stealth that Commodore respected, often approaching the horse pens under the cover of a moonless night. He did not view them with the hatred typical of other frontiersmen. Instead, he treated them as professional adversaries. He established a system of tripwires and bells around the corrals, creating a primitive but effective early warning system. When a raid occurred, Commodore did not fire wildly into the dark. He waited for a silhouette to cross a known landmark, then fired a single calculated shot to discourage the approach. He preferred the heavy impact of a .45-70 projectile to send a message that Navajo Springs was a fortified position. The white outlaws who frequented the region were a different and more volatile problem. These were men who had been pushed out of the more settled parts of the West, individuals with nothing to lose and a total lack of regard for human life. They came to Navajo Springs looking for fresh mounts and easy plunder. Commodore encountered a group of 3 such men late in the summer of 1881. They rode into the camp with their hands near their holsters, their eyes scanning the area for weaknesses. Commodore stood on the porch of his shack, his long hair tied back with a leather thong, his hands resting visibly on the railing. He did not invite them to dismount. The tension was a cold, sharp thing in the heat of the afternoon. When the leader of the group made a move to draw his weapon, Commodore's Winchester was already at his shoulder. He fired a projectile that struck the pommel of the man's saddle, sending shards of leather and wood into his thigh. The men retreated at a gallop, leaving a trail of dust that hung in the stagnant air for 20 minutes. The environment of Navajo Springs was a test of physical and mental endurance. The water, while life-saving, was high in minerals that left a bitter aftertaste and caused digestive distress for those unaccustomed to it. The sun was a relentless force that cracked the skin and turned the eyes into narrowed slits. Commodore managed these conditions with a stoic lack of complaint. He wore a wide-brimmed hat that cast a deep shadow over his face, and he kept his skin covered to prevent the blistering that affected less experienced men. He observed the movements of the local wildlife, the coyotes, the rattlesnakes, and the hawks, using their behavior as a secondary indicator of human presence. If the birds suddenly took flight from a distant draw, he knew a rider was approaching long before he could see the dust cloud. His relationship with James D. Houck was purely professional and defined by a mutual understanding of the risks involved. Guthrie provided the supplies and the authority, while Commodore provided the lethality required to maintain the ranch's integrity. They spoke rarely, and when they did, the conversation was limited to the number of head of cattle or the condition of the grass. Commodore preferred this arrangement. He did not seek the camaraderie of the bunkhouse or the social rituals of the town. He was a man who found comfort in the predictable laws of ballistics and the unforgiving logic of the desert. He was becoming a legend among the Navajo and the white settlers alike, known as the Iron Man of the Springs, a figure who seemed to never sleep and never miss. During the autumn months, the violence in the surrounding Apache County began to escalate as the Pleasant Valley War started to simmer in the south. While Navajo Springs was north of the main conflict, the ripples of lawlessness reached the ranch. Stragglers from the warring factions would often pass through, looking for a place to rest or a horse to steal. Commodore treated these men with a uniform suspicion. He made it clear that while they were welcome to water their horses, they were not welcome to linger. He stood guard while they drank, his rifle never leaving his hands. His reputation for a cold, detached efficiency served as a more effective deterrent than a dozen deputy marshals. He was a singular force in a vast, empty space, and he knew that his survival depended on maintaining that image. The physical reality of his work involved a high degree of manual labor. When he was not guarding the springs, he was repairing the heavy timber fences that were constantly pushed over by the weight of thirsty cattle. He used a sledgehammer and iron spikes to secure the rails, the rhythmic thud of metal on wood echoing across the flats. The work turned his shoulders into cords of hard muscle and permanently blackened his fingernails. He did not delegate these tasks. He performed them himself, viewing the physical exertion as a way to maintain his edge. He believed that a man who became soft in his habits would become slow in his reactions. He lived on a diet of beans, salted pork, and hardtack, fuel meant for a machine rather than a man looking for pleasure. One specific night in October, a group of horse thieves attempted a sophisticated maneuver to draw Commodore away from the main corral. They started a small brush fire a mile to the west, hoping he would ride out to investigate. Commodore saw the orange glow on the horizon but remained at his post. He understood the psychology of the raid. Instead of riding toward the fire, he moved into the darkness of a nearby dry wash, positioning himself where he had a clear view of the rear gate. 20 minutes later, 2 men approached the gate on foot carrying wire cutters. Commodore waited until they were within 30 feet before he spoke. The sound of his voice in the absolute silence of the desert caused one of the men to drop his tools in shock. He did not kill them. He forced them to strip to their undergarments and walk toward the distant town of Holbrook, keeping their horses as payment for the disturbance. The brutality of the situation at Navajo Springs was often quiet. It was the brutality of a horse dying from a broken leg in a gopher hole, or the sight of a man driven mad by the heat wandering into the springs with skin peeling in sheets from his shoulders. Commodore witnessed these things without a change in expression. He performed the necessary mercies, such as putting down a suffering animal, with the same mechanical precision he used in combat. He did not find joy in the act of killing, but he did not find sorrow in it either. It was a required function of his environment. He viewed the world as a series of problems that could be solved with either a hammer or a bullet. His grooming habits remained an anomaly in the harsh conditions. Despite the lack of proper facilities, he managed to keep his hair clean and his clothes in good repair. He used the mineral water of the springs to wash, ignoring the way it made his hair stiff and difficult to manage. He used a straight razor to keep his face smooth, performing the task without a mirror by the sense of touch alone. This attention to his appearance was not about vanity. It was about maintaining a sense of order in a world that was constantly trying to dissolve into chaos. To Commodore, a man who gave up on his appearance was a man who was giving up on his discipline. He remained the dandy even when his boots were caked in cattle dung and his shirt was stained with wood smoke. By the end of 1881, the success of the Guthrie Ranch under Commodore's protection was undeniable. The loss of livestock to theft had dropped to almost zero, a feat that was unheard of in the Arizona Territory at the time. The owners of other ranches began to take notice, and the political leaders in Apache County started to view Commodore as more than just a hired gunman. They saw a man who could impose his will on a landscape that had defied all previous attempts at colonization. They saw a potential sheriff. Commodore was aware of these discussions but did not participate in them. He was content with his life at the Springs, where the rules were simple and the enemies were visible. The transition from the ranch to the sheriff's office was not an immediate jump, but a slow pull. He began to receive visits from men in suits and polished hats, individuals who spoke of the need for civilization and law and order. They described a county where the outlaws had become so bold they were walking into the courts and intimidating the judges. Commodore listened to these descriptions with a neutral expression, his eyes never leaving the horizon. He was not moved by their rhetoric about the greatness of the territory. He was moved by the description of the Blevins gang and the Cooper brothers, men who were essentially the same breed of bullies he had been fighting since he left Tennessee. He recognized a larger field of conflict, one that would require more than just guarding a watering hole. The physical toll of his time at Navajo Springs was evident in the way he moved. He had developed a permanent alertness, a tension in his frame that never fully dissipated even when he was asleep. He slept in short bursts, waking at the slightest change in the ambient noise. His hands were never far from a weapon, and he never sat with his back to an opening. This was the cost of being the sole guardian of a vital resource. He had become a human extension of the terrain, as hard and unforgiving as the basalt ridges that surrounded the springs. He was 30 years old, but he carried the weight of a man who had seen a century of violence. Navajo Springs itself was changing. The arrival of the railroad was bringing more people and more problems. The isolated autonomy that Commodore enjoyed was being eroded by the encroachment of a more complex society. He saw the tracks being laid and understood that the era of the solitary range guard was reaching its conclusion. The power was shifting from the individual to the institution, and if he wanted to remain a factor in the development of the territory, he would have to become part of that institution. He did not like the idea of being managed by a board of supervisors. but he liked the idea of a county-wide license to hunt even less. In December of 1882, he made the decision to leave the Guthrie Ranch. He packed his few belongings, including his prized Winchester and his grooming kit, and prepared to move toward the administrative center of the county. He left Navajo Springs in the hands of a younger man who Guthrie had hired to replace him, though both knew the replacement would not have the same effect. As Commodore rode away, he did not look back at the small shack or the bubbling water. He was looking toward Holbrook, a town that was a tinderbox of racial tension, political corruption, and outlaw violence. He was going there to put out the fire, or to burn with it. His departure was a significant event for the Navajo who had lived in the shadow of his rifle for 2 years. They watched him ride out from the ridges, noting the way his long hair caught the afternoon light. To them, he was a force of nature that was moving on to a different part of the sky. They did not celebrate his leaving, as they knew that whatever came next might be less predictable and more prone to indiscriminate violence. Commodore had been a hard man, but he had been a consistent one. In the desert, consistency was the closest thing a man could find to justice. The journey to the seat of power in Apache County was a long ride through the heart of the territory. Commodore used the time to mentally prepare for the shift in his responsibilities. He would no longer be protecting a single ranch. He would be protecting a population of thousands spread across a vast and broken land. He thought about the men he would have to face, the outlaws who had grown fat on the weakness of the existing law. He did not feel fear or excitement. He felt the same clinical focus he felt when he was lining up a shot on a target at 300 yards. He was simply adjusting his sights for a different kind of range. As he entered the outskirts of the settlements, he noticed the change in the atmosphere. There was a frantic energy in the towns, a sense of desperation among the honest people and a sense of arrogance among the criminals. He saw the graffiti on the walls of the saloons and the bullet holes in the signs of the shopkeepers. He saw the way the people lowered their eyes when he rode past, unsure of who he was but sensing the lethality he carried. He was a stranger in a world of his own making, a lawman who had not yet been sworn in. He checked the action of his Winchester one last time before entering the town center, the mechanical click sounding loud in the crowded street. The era of the dandy sheriff was about to begin in earnest. Commodore Perry Owens was no longer just a name whispered in the camps of the Navajo or the offices of the ranch owners. He was a physical reality that was moving toward a collision with the history of the West. He was the man who would take on a house full of outlaws alone. But before he could do that, he had to navigate the murky waters of frontier politics. He was prepared for the blood, but he was less prepared for the paperwork. Still, he rode forward, his posture upright and his eyes fixed on the task ahead. The sun set on 1882 as Commodore reached his destination. The temperature dropped rapidly, the cold biting through his coat and numbing his fingers. He found a room in a local boarding house, one that offered a view of the main street. He spent the evening as he always did, maintaining his equipment and grooming his hair. He was preparing himself for the scrutiny of the public and the violence of the office. He was a man of the Springs who was now a man of the law. The outlaws of Apache County were sleeping in their beds, unaware that their nemesis had arrived. November 2nd, 1886. The wooden floorboards of the St. John's Courthouse groaned under the weight of frontiersmen, ranchers, and merchants who had gathered to witness the final tally of a political contest that would redefine the geography of power in northern Arizona. Apache County was a sprawling, fractured expanse of high desert and pine-covered ridges, a place where the law had long been a theoretical concept easily ignored by those with enough ammunition. The election for sheriff was not merely a choice between two men. It was a referendum on whether the territory would remain a playground for rustlers or transition into a regulated society. Commodore Perry Owens stood at the edge of the crowd, his presence a jarring anomaly in the room of soot-stained laborers and dusty politicians. He wore a tailored frock coat of dark wool, his silver-mounted revolvers resting in holsters of high-grade leather, and his hair cascaded down his back in meticulously brushed waves. To the casual observer, he appeared to be a traveling performer or a wealthy gambler. Yet the men who had seen him in action at Navajo Springs knew that his polished exterior masked a lethality that was unmatched in the territory. The political landscape of the county was divided by deep-seated religious and ethnic tensions that often spilled over into violence. The northern part of the county, centered around Holbrook, was dominated by the interests of the Aztec Land and Cattle Company, a massive operation known as the Hash Knife Outfit that employed hundreds of cowboys, many of whom were wanted men from other states. To the south, St. John's was the hub of the Mormon and Hispanic populations, groups that often found themselves at odds with the aggressive expansion of the cattle kings. The incumbent law enforcement had proven incapable of navigating these factions, often taking sides or simply refusing to intervene when the Cooper-Blevins gang or other outlaw outfits raided local ranches. Commodore ran as an independent, though he carried the support of the Republican faction and the desperate backing of the cattlemen who were tired of losing their herds to organized theft. His platform was simple and devoid of the typical campaign rhetoric. He promised to serve warrants that other men were afraid to touch. The ballots were small slips of paper, hand-printed and often smudged with the grease of the men who cast them. In the small, smoke-filled rooms used as polling stations in towns like Snowflake and Springerville, the air was thick with the scent of unwashed wool and cheap tobacco. Voters arrived on horseback and in wagons, many of them carrying rifles as a matter of course. There were rumors of intimidation at the ballot boxes, with armed men standing near the entrances of saloons to influence the choices of the undecided. Commodore did not participate in the typical glad-handing or public speaking that defined frontier politics. He spent the day of the election in Holbrook, leaning against the wall of the train station, his eyes scanning the crowd with a predatory stillness. He did not need to ask for votes. His reputation as a man who had survived the lonely vigils of the Springs spoke for him. The opposition viewed Commodore with a mixture of amusement and genuine concern. His long hair and attention to his clothing earned him the derogatory label of a dandy, a term meant to imply a lack of masculinity or grit. His rivals whispered that a man who spent so much time grooming himself would never have the stomach for the bloody business of clearing out the outlaw nests in the Mogollon Rim. However, these criticisms ignored the physical reality of Owens' history. The scars on his hands from manual labor and the way his fingers naturally hovered near the action of his Winchester told a different story. He was a man who had mastered the mechanical details of survival, and his candidacy represented a shift toward a more professional, albeit more violent, form of law enforcement. As the evening of November 2nd progressed, the results began to trickle in from the outlying precincts. The process was slow, hampered by the vast distances and the primitive communication lines of the era. Messengers arrived on lathered horses carrying leather pouches filled with the tabulated votes. In St. John's, the tension was nearly at a breaking point. The Mormon community, which valued order and communal security, had largely swung behind Commodore, seeing him as a tool to curb the lawlessness of the transient cowboy population. The Hash Knife Cowboys, conversely, were wary of a man who could not be bought or intimidated. The tallying process took place under the flickering light of kerosene lamps, with clerks marking tallies on large chalkboards while the crowd watched in a silence that was periodically broken by the clatter of spurs on the floor. By midnight, it became clear that the dandy from Navajo Springs had secured a narrow but decisive victory. The final count showed that Commodore Perry Owens was the new sheriff of Apache County. The news spread through the town with the speed of a prairie fire. In the saloons, the reaction was polarized. honest merchants toasted to a future of protected commerce, while the rustlers and their associates began to quietly discuss the necessity of either leaving the county or eliminating the new lawman before he could take his oath. Commodore received the news of his victory with a curt nod of his head. He did not celebrate with whiskey or join the boisterous crowds. He retreated to his room in the boarding house, where he methodically disassembled his rifle to oil the internal mechanisms. He knew that the piece of paper confirming his election was not a shield. It was a target. The transition of power was scheduled for the 1st of the new year, but the atmosphere in the county changed the moment the results were verified. Commodore began to receive letters and verbal messages from citizens detailing the crimes that had gone unpunished for years. He spent the intervening weeks studying the geography of his new domain with the intensity of a general preparing for a campaign. He mapped out the locations of the various outlaw hideouts, from the deep canyons of the south to the desolate badlands of the north. He understood that the county was a complex machine of shifting loyalties, and he intended to be the one to regulate its movements. He did not hire a large force of deputies, preferring to rely on a few men whose skill with a firearm was matched by their loyalty to the concept of the law. The physical office of the sheriff was a modest room in the courthouse, smelling of stale paper and old wood. The desk was cluttered with unresolved warrants and descriptions of stolen property that had been ignored by his predecessors. Commodore spent his first days in the office organizing this chaos. He filed the warrants by the severity of the crime and the likelihood of the suspect being found within his jurisdiction. He did not use a typewriter. He wrote his notes in a precise, cramped hand, detailing the physical descriptions of the men he intended to hunt. He was creating a ledger of retribution, a list of names that would soon be crossed out with the finality of a bullet. He ignored the political maneuvering of the county supervisors, making it clear that his only interest was the enforcement of the criminal code. One of the first challenges he faced was the open defiance of the Cooper-Blevins gang, a group of brothers and associates who had turned the town of Holbrook into their personal fiefdom. They were known for their arrogance, often riding through the streets while firing their revolvers into the air to remind the citizens of their power. Andy Blevins, the eldest and most volatile of the group, was wanted for murder in Texas and was a suspect in numerous cattle thefts within Apache County. Commodore did not rush into a confrontation. He watched them from the shadows, learning their patterns and identifying their supporters. He understood that a premature move would lead to a chaotic shootout that might result in the deaths of innocent bystanders. He wanted a clean, decisive strike that would serve as a warning to every other outlaw in the territory. The winter of 1886 was particularly brutal, with heavy snows blanketing the high country and trapping many of the smaller ranches in a state of icy isolation. Commodore used this time to establish his presence in the outlying communities. He rode through the blizzards, his long coat caked in frost and his face reddened by the biting wind. He visited the Mormon settlements in the south and the Hispanic villages along the river, assuring the residents that the days of unchecked rustling were coming to an end. He did not make long speeches. He simply showed up, a silent and imposing figure who looked like he had been carved out of the very basalt of the Arizona mountains. His physical endurance in the face of the winter storms earned him a grudging respect from men who had previously dismissed him as a city-dwelling dandy. The interior of the Apache County Jail was a grim reflection of the state of the law. It was a cold, damp facility with iron bars that were rusted and locks that could be bypassed with a simple piece of wire. Commodore ordered new locks from the east and personally supervised the reinforcement of the cell doors. He wanted the criminals to understand that once they were caught by his hand, there was no easy way out. He also implemented a strict regime for the prisoners, providing them with basic sustenance but allowing no luxuries. He viewed the jail not as a place for rehabilitation, but as a cage for the predatory elements of society. He spent his nights in the office above the cells, the silence of the building only interrupted by the occasional moan of a prisoner or the scratching of his pen on a warrant. His relationship with the Aztec Land and Cattle Company was a delicate balance of cooperation and independence. The company had supported his election because they wanted their cattle protected, but they also expected a certain level of leniency for their own cowboys, many of whom were prone to violence when they came into town for a weekend of drinking. Commodore disabused them of this notion early in his tenure. When a group of hash-knife cowboys began to tear up a saloon in Holbrook, Commodore arrived alone. He did not draw his gun immediately. He simply walked into the center of the room and told them to leave. When one of the cowboys made a disparaging remark about his hair and reached for a bottle, Commodore struck him across the face with the barrel of his revolver, breaking the man's jaw. The others, seeing the cold, focused anger in the sheriff's eyes, opted to leave peacefully. This incident established a new rule in Apache County. The law applied to everyone, regardless of who signed their paycheck. The ranchers realized that they had hired a man who could not be controlled, and the cowboys realized that the dandy was more dangerous than any man they had encountered on the trail. Commodore's reputation for fairness was not based on empathy, but on a rigid, almost mathematical adherence to the rules. He did not care about the motivations behind a crime. He only cared about the fact that a crime had been committed. This lack of nuance made him a terrifying figure to the criminal element, as there was no room for negotiation or excuses. By the spring of 1887, the tension in the county had moved from the political sphere to the physical one. The outlaws were feeling the pressure of the new sheriff's patrols, and the Blevins gang was becoming increasingly bold in their threats against his life. Commodore continued to groom himself with the same meticulous care, appearing in the streets of Holbrook in polished boots and a clean shirt even after a week-long hunt in the mountains. This consistency was a psychological weapon. It suggested that the violence of his profession had no effect on his personal discipline. He remained a man of few words, his silence acting as a void that his enemies filled with their own fears. The physical reality of Holbrook in 1887 was one of dust, wood smoke, and the constant vibration of the passing trains. The town was a collection of false-fronted buildings huddled against the tracks of the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad. It was a place where the modern world of steam and iron collided with the ancient, brutal world of the desert. Commodore walked the boardwalks of the town with a deliberate, rhythmic stride, his spurs jingling with every step. He was a constant presence, a reminder that the chaos of the past was being replaced by the order of the present. He would stop at the general store to purchase ammunition, examining each cartridge for defects before placing it in his belt. He did not buy in bulk. He bought with the intention of using every single projectile with lethal accuracy. In the saloons, the talk was of the upcoming showdown. Everyone knew that the sheriff and the Blevins family were on a collision course. Andy Blevins had been heard bragging that he would cut the sheriff's long hair and use it for a cinch on his saddle. Commodore heard these reports but did not respond. He knew that words were cheap in the territory and that the final outcome would be decided by the speed of a hand and the reliability of a firing pin. He continued his work, serving minor warrants and maintaining the peace, all while keeping a sharp eye on the house in Holbrook where the Blevins family had taken up residence. The historical context of this period was one of transition for the entire American West. The great cattle empires were being challenged by the arrival of the small farmer and the expansion of the federal government's reach. Commodore was a man of the old school who had been co-opted into the service of the new. He was a bridge between the era of the individual gunfighter and the era of the professional law enforcement officer. He carried the tools of the former to enforce the rules of the latter. His victory in the election was a sign that the people of the territory were ready for this change, even if it meant a period of intense and bloody conflict. As the months passed, the physical toll of the office began to show in the deepening lines around Commodore's eyes and the gray that was beginning to touch his temples. He was 35 years old, but the weight of the county's problems made him feel much older. He suffered from bouts of digestive pain, a legacy of the alkaline water at Navajo Springs, but he never let it affect his performance. He remained as focused and lethal as the day he arrived in the territory. He spent his few hours of leisure reading the local newspapers and keeping abreast of the legal developments in the territorial capital of Prescott. He wanted to ensure that every move he made was within the bounds of his authority, leaving no room for his enemies to challenge him in court. The relationship between the sheriff and the Hispanic population of the county was one of mutual respect. Commodore learned enough Spanish to communicate basic legal concepts, and he was known to treat the Hispanic residents with a level of dignity that was rare among white lawmen of the era. He protected their land claims against the encroachments of the big cattle companies, earning him a loyal following in the southern precincts. This support was vital as it provided him with a network of informants who could alert him to the movements of outlaws in the remote parts of the county. He understood that the law could only function if it had the support of the people it was meant to protect. By the summer of 1887, the stage was fully set for the events that would make Commodore Perry Owens a household name across the United States. The warrants for the arrest of Andy Blevins and his associates were sitting on his desk, signed and ready for service. The Blevins family was fortified in their house in Holbrook, surrounded by a group of heavily armed supporters. The townspeople were waiting, their breath held in anticipation of the violence they knew was coming. Commodore looked at the brass-cased cartridges in his hand, feeling the weight and the balance of the metal. He was not a man of destiny. He was a man of duty, and his duty was about to lead him into the most significant gunfight of his life. The final paragraph of his pre-combat career was defined by a moment of quiet reflection in the sheriff's office. He looked out the window at the dusty street of Holbrook, watching the shadows lengthen as the sun dipped toward the horizon. He was alone, as he had been for most of his life. He did not feel the need for a posse or a team of deputies for the task at hand. He believed that the law should be served by the man who held the office, a single individual standing against the forces of chaos. He stood up, adjusted his frock coat, picked up his Winchester, and walked out of the door. The time for politics and paperwork was over. The time for the dandy sheriff to earn his reputation in blood had arrived. September 4th, 1887. The sun sat high over Holbrook, Arizona, casting a flat bleaching light across the town's main thoroughfare. The heat radiated off the iron rails of the Atlantic and Pacific tracks, creating a shimmering distortion in the air that made distant buildings appear to undulate. Commodore Perry Owens finished a midday meal at a local boarding house, his movements slow and deliberate as he wiped his mouth with a linen cloth. He stood up, adjusted the drape of his dark frock coat, and checked the seating of his two silver-plated revolvers. His long hair was freshly brushed, falling past his shoulders in dark, heavy waves that caught the light. He picked up his Winchester Model 1873 from where it leaned against the wall, working the lever once to ensure a cartridge was seated in the chamber before lowering the hammer to the half-cock position. He stepped out onto the boardwalk, the dry heat immediately pressing against his skin like a physical weight. The town of Holbrook was unusually quiet for a Sunday afternoon, as if the citizens sensed a shift in the local atmospheric pressure. Commodore walked with a rhythmic, measured gait toward the cottage occupied by the Blevins family and their associates. He did not seek out a posse or request the assistance of the local deputies, choosing instead to handle the high-risk warrant alone. He carried a legal document for the arrest of Andy Blevins, also known as Andy Cooper, on charges related to the theft of horses from the Navajo reservation. The house was a small frame structure situated on the outskirts of the town, surrounded by a yard of packed dirt and parched weeds. As Commodore approached, he could see several horses tied to the hitching rail, their hides damp with sweat and their chests heaving from a recent hard ride. Commodore reached the perimeter of the property and stopped, his eyes scanning the windows for movement. He saw the curtain shift in the front room, and the silhouette of a man appeared briefly before vanishing back into the shadows of the interior. He did not take cover behind the fence or the nearby trees, but continued walking directly toward the front porch. Each footfall on the dry earth produced a small puff of dust that coated the toes of his polished boots. He stepped onto the wooden porch, the boards creaking under his weight with a sharp, dry sound that echoed in the stillness. He stood to the side of the door, his Winchester held across his chest at a 45-degree angle, his finger resting lightly on the outside of the trigger guard. He used his left hand to knock firmly on the wood, the sound of the impact flat and final. The door opened a few inches, revealing the face of Owens-Blevins. The man looked disheveled, his eyes bloodshot and his hand gripping the edge of the doorframe with a white-knuckled intensity. Commodore did not waste time with pleasantries or preamble. He stated clearly that he had a warrant for Andy's arrest and instructed him to step out onto the porch with his hands visible. Andy sneered, his lip curling to reveal yellowed teeth, and informed the sheriff that he would not be going anywhere. He attempted to close the door, but Commodore stepped forward, using the barrel of the Winchester to keep the opening from narrowing. The mechanical tension between the two men was a physical thing, a raw conflict of wills played out in the space of a few inches of pine board. Inside the house, the sound of scurrying feet and muffled whispers indicated that the other occupants were preparing for a fight. Commodore recognized the voices of John Blevins and Mose Roberts, both men with reputations for violence and a lack of respect for the law. He remained calm, his breathing steady and his gaze locked on Andy's eyes. He repeated his command, his voice devoid of emotion or hesitation. Andy reached behind the door, his hand searching for a revolver that sat on a nearby table. Commodore sensed the shift in the man's posture and the sudden focus in his eyes. As Andy's fingers closed around the grip of the weapon, Commodore fired his first shot through the wood of the door. The explosion of the .44-40 cartridge was deafening in the confined space of the porch. The heavy slug punched through the pine door and struck Owens-Blevins in the abdomen, the force of the impact spinning him backward into the room. He collapsed against a chair, his hands clutching at the gaping wound as blood began to soak through his shirt and pool on the floorboards. The smell of burnt powder and ozone filled the air, mingling with the copper scent of fresh blood. Commodore did not pause to assess the damage. He immediately moved to a position where he could observe the front window and the door simultaneously. He worked the lever of the Winchester with a blur of motion, ejecting the spent brass casing and chambering a fresh round. The brass hit the porch with a metallic ring that was lost in the subsequent chaos. John Blevins, seeing his brother fall, appeared at the door with a six-shooter in his hand. He fired blindly into the afternoon glare, the projectile missing Commodore by several feet and striking the sheriff's horse, which was tied at the edge of the yard. The animal shrieked in pain and reared up, its hooves churning the dirt. Commodore responded with a single aimed shot that struck John in the upper arm, shattering the bone and sending the revolver flying from his nerveless fingers. John retreated into the house, howling with pain as he gripped the mangled limb. The interior of the cottage was now a scene of absolute carnage, with the screams of the wounded competing with the shouts of those still trying to organize a defense. Mose Roberts, an associate of the family who had been staying at the house, decided to attempt a flanking maneuver. He climbed through a side window, dropping onto the dirt with a heavy thud. He carried a revolver and looked toward the porch, hoping to catch Commodore in a crossfire. Commodore heard the sound of the window frame splintering and turned his head just as Roberts gained his footing. Without moving from his position on the porch, Commodore shouldered the Winchester and fired. The slug caught Roberts in the chest, penetrating the lung and exiting through the shoulder blade. Roberts staggered back, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he collapsed into a patch of weeds. He lay there, his fingers digging into the earth as the life drained out of him in a series of violent tremors. Inside the house, a young boy named Samuel Houston Blevins, only 15 years of age, grabbed a revolver from the floor. He was driven by a frantic, unthinking, protective instinct for his older brothers. His mother, Mary Blevins, tried to hold him back, her hands clawing at his sleeves as she begged him to stay down. The boy broke free and rushed toward the door, his face twisted in a mask of grief and fury. He emerged onto the porch with the gun raised, his eyes fixed on the man who had shot his family. Commodore saw the youth and the weapon in his hand. He did not hesitate, knowing that a bullet from a 15-year-old was just as lethal as one from a grown man. He fired a single shot that struck Samuel in the chest at point-blank range. The impact of the projectile threw the boy backward into his mother's arms. She collapsed with him, her screams echoing through the neighborhood and drawing the attention of the townspeople who had been watching from a distance. Commodore stood alone on the porch, the Winchester still at his shoulder, the barrel emitting a thin wisp of gray smoke. He remained in a crouched position, his eyes darting from the windows to the corners of the building, waiting for the next threat to emerge. The silence that followed the final shot was more oppressive than the noise of the battle. The only sounds were the distant moaning of the wounded and the rhythmic thumping of the injured horse's hooves against the ground. Commodore waited for several minutes, his thumb resting on the hammer of his rifle. He did not enter the house, knowing that there might be other armed men hidden in the back rooms or under the floorboards. He called out for any remaining occupants to surrender, but the only response was the sobbing of Mary Blevins as she held her dying son. The sheriff began to back away from the porch, keeping his weapon trained on the door. He moved with a slow, deliberate caution, ensuring that he did not trip over the debris or the body of Mose Roberts. He reached the hitching rail and untied his horse, leading the wounded animal away from the immediate line of fire. The horse was bleeding heavily from a wound in its neck, the crimson fluid staining the white dust of the road. The entire engagement had lasted less than 3 minutes, yet in that span of time, Commodore Perry Owens had effectively dismantled the leadership of the most feared gang in Apache County. He had fired 4 shots and achieved 4 hits, a display of marksmanship that defied the chaotic reality of close-quarters combat. He reached the safety of a nearby building and signaled for the town's doctor and the local marshal to approach. He did not show any signs of emotional distress or physical exhaustion. His hands were steady, and his long hair remained perfectly in place, despite the violence of his movements. He leaned against the brick wall of the building, his eyes never leaving the Blevins' cottage. The townspeople began to emerge from their homes and shops, moving toward the scene with a mixture of morbid curiosity and profound shock. They saw the body of Mose Roberts in the yard and heard the cries of the family inside the house. They looked at the sheriff, who stood like a silent sentinel in the shade, and realized that the rumors of his lethality were not exaggerations. He was a man who had translated the cold logic of the buffalo stand to the streets of Holbrook. He had not used a posse because he did not need one. He was a self-contained unit of law enforcement, a mechanical force that functioned with a singular bloody purpose. The medical reality inside the house was grim. Andy Blevins was dying from internal hemorrhaging, the slug having caused catastrophic damage to his intestines and liver. John Blevins was in a state of shock, his arm mangled beyond repair. Samuel Blevins was already dead, his small frame limp in the dirt of the entryway. The interior of the home was splattered with blood and bits of bone, the furniture overturned and the walls peppered with splintered holes from the exchange. The doctor arrived and began the futile task of trying to stabilize the wounded, while the marshal started the process of collecting the weapons and identifying the dead. Commodore did not participate in these activities, viewing his job as finished once the resistance had ceased. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, the full significance of the event started to settle over the community. The Blevins gang, which had intimidated the region for years, had been broken in a single afternoon by a man they had mocked as a dandy. The power dynamic in Apache County had shifted permanently. The rustlers and outlaws who had operated with impunity now understood that the new sheriff would not engage in negotiations or legal maneuvering. He would simply arrive at the door with a Winchester and a warrant, and the outcome would be decided in seconds. Commodore watched as the bodies were loaded into a wagon, his expression neutral and his thoughts private. The physical toll on Commodore was invisible but present. The adrenaline that had sustained him during the fight was beginning to recede, leaving behind a cold, hollow sensation in his chest. He felt the grit of the gunpowder on his face and the metallic taste of the air in the back of his throat. He walked back toward his office, the wounded horse limping behind him. He did not stop to talk to the reporters or the curious onlookers who tried to block his path. He had a report to write and a ledger to update. He needed to record the facts of the service of the warrant and the subsequent deaths of the suspects with the same precision he used to aim his rifle. That evening, the town of Holbrook was a hive of activity as the news of the shootout was telegraphed to the territorial capital and beyond. The story of the long-haired sheriff who took on a house full of outlaws alone would soon become a staple of frontier lore. However, for Commodore, it was merely the fulfillment of the promise he had made during the election. He had told the voters he would serve the warrants, and he had done so. He did not see himself as a hero or a villain. He saw himself as a necessary tool for the establishment of order. He cleaned his Winchester in the quiet of his office, the smell of the oil a familiar comfort after the stench of the shootout. The historical context of the Holbrook shootout was one of a final violent spasm of the old frontier before the arrival of the 20th century. It was a moment where the individual gunfighter's skill was utilized for the benefit of the state, a synthesis of the wild past and the regulated future. Commodore Perry Owens was the perfect avatar for this transition. He possessed the lethality of the outlaw, but the discipline of the soldier. He understood that the only way to end the violence of the territory was to meet it with a superior, more focused form of violence. He had turned Main Street into a war zone, but in doing so, he had ensured that it would eventually become a place of peace. In the days following the fight, the political repercussions began to manifest. Some critics argued that the sheriff had been too quick to use lethal force, particularly in the case of the young Owens-Blevins. Others hailed him as a savior who had finally brought the rule of law to a lawless land. Commodore ignored the debate, focusing instead on the remaining warrants on his desk. He knew that the Blevins family was only one part of a larger network of criminal activity that needed to be dismantled. He spent his time planning his next moves, identifying the hideouts of the cattle thieves in the Mogollon Rim and the horse specialists along the New Mexico border. He was a man with a list, and he intended to finish it. The physical environment of the Blevins house remained a scar on the town for weeks. The bloodstains on the porch were difficult to remove, and the smell of death lingered in the dry air. The house was eventually sold and the family dispersed, but the memory of the 3 minutes in September remained a defining feature of Holbrook's identity. People would point out the bullet holes in the walls and recount the story of the dandy sheriff to every traveler who passed through the station. Commodore became a living landmark, a figure that inspired both awe and a deep, unsettling fear. He was the man who had stood in the center of the storm and emerged without a scratch. His relationship with the townspeople became more distant after the shootout. He was no longer just a lawman. He was a force of nature that had visited a terrible violence upon their community. The merchants were grateful for the security he provided, but they crossed the street when they saw him coming. The children stopped playing when he walked by, their eyes wide as they stared at the long hair and the silver revolvers. Commodore did not seem to notice or care about this social isolation. He had never sought the approval of the crowd, and he did not need it now. He was content in his solitude, finding his only true companionship in the mechanical reliability of his weapons. The injury to his horse was a source of genuine distress for Commodore. He spent hours in the stable tending to the animal, cleaning the wound and applying salves to prevent infection. He felt a sense of responsibility for the creature that had been caught in the crossfire of human conflict. The horse eventually recovered, though it carried a thick, ropey scar on its neck for the rest of its life. To Commodore, the scar was a reminder of the cost of his profession. He understood that every action had a consequence, and that the price of order was often paid in blood and suffering. He accepted this reality without complaint, viewing it as an inherent part of the world he occupied. By the end of September, the immediate crisis had passed, but the tension in Apache County remained high. The friends and associates of the Blevins gang were still out there, hiding in the canyons and plotting their revenge. Commodore knew that the shootout was not the end of the conflict, but merely the opening salvo in a longer, more grinding war of attrition. He continued his patrols, riding through the dust and the heat with his Winchester across his saddle. He was looking for the next name. On his list, the next house that needed to be approached, and the next door that would be answered with a snarl and a gun. He was ready for whatever came next, his mind as sharp and cold as the steel of his barrel. The narrative of Commodore Perry Owens at the Blevins house is a story of a man who stripped away the layers of social pretense and political compromise to reveal the raw, violent core of the frontier. He was a man of action who did not need words to justify his presence or his methods. He was the dandy sheriff who had become a legend, not through poetry or myth, but through the literal gritty reality of 4 shots in the afternoon sun. He had transformed the landscape of northern Arizona, leaving behind a trail of spent brass and a legacy of uncompromising justice that would be discussed for a century to come. September 5th, 1887. The sun rose over the eastern plateau, illuminating the dried, rust-colored stains that had saturated the grain of the wooden porch at the Blevins cottage. The morning air was sharp and carried the metallic scent of oxidized blood and the pungent odor of carbolic acid used by the local physician. Commodore Perry Owens sat in his office at the county jail, his hands moving with rhythmic precision as he wiped a thin layer of oil onto the breech block of his Winchester. He had not slept since the confrontation, but his eyes showed no signs of fatigue or the red webbing of exhaustion. He had spent the preceding hours documenting the mechanical sequence of the shooting, recording the exact placement of each .44-40 projectile in a ledger that would serve as the official record for the coroner's jury. The town of Holbrook remained in a state of paralysis, the usual morning bustle of the railroad station replaced by a hushed, expectant tension as the community waited for the next casualty. Inside the cottage, the physical reality of the shootout manifested in the labored, wet breathing of Andy Blevins. The slug had entered his abdomen at a high velocity, tearing through the small intestine and lodging against the inner wall of the pelvis. The surgeon, working by the flickering light of a kerosene lamp, had been unable to locate the distorted piece of metal amidst the shredded tissue and fecal matter that had leaked into the peritoneal cavity. Andy's skin had turned a waxy yellow hue, and his pulse was a thin, erratic thread that skipped every 4th beat. He remained conscious for several hours, his fingers clawing at the sweat-soaked sheets as peritonitis began to inflame his internal organs. He died at 6:30 in the morning, his body finally succumbing to the massive systemic infection and internal hemorrhaging caused by the heavy-caliber rifle shot. John Blevins occupied a separate room, his left arm, immobilized by a series of wooden splints and heavy bandages. The projectile from the sheriff's rifle had struck the humerus bone directly, shattering it into 20 distinct fragments that had shredded the surrounding bicep muscle. The doctor had spent 3 hours picking bone splinters out of the wound with a pair of silver forceps, working without the benefit of anesthesia beyond a few swallows of whiskey. John's face was a mask of gray shock, his breathing shallow and rapid as his body struggled to process the trauma. He would survive the encounter, but the limb would remain a withered, useless appendage, a permanent physical record of the moment he raised a gun against the law. He lay in a state of semi-lucid agony, listening to the sounds of his brother's body being prepared for burial in the adjacent room. The body of Mose Roberts remained at the morgue, a cold utilitarian space located in the back of the local furniture store. The coroner, a man named J.W. Brown, performed a cursory examination of the remains to determine the cause of death for the official inquest. The .44-40 slug had entered the center of the chest, punching a clean hole through the sternum and liquefying the upper lobe of the right lung before exiting through the scapula. The exit wound was a ragged opening 3 inches in diameter, surrounded by blackened bruising and torn muscle. Rigor mortis had set in by dawn, fixing Robert's features in a grimace of sudden, violent surprise. He was an associate of the gang with no immediate family in the territory, and his remains were handled with the impersonal efficiency reserved for the unclaimed dead. The coroner's inquest convened at 10 o'clock in the morning in a small, partitioned area of the courthouse. 6 local men were sworn in as a jury to evaluate the legality of the sheriff's actions. The room was stifling, the heat of the day already pressing through the thin walls and drawing the smell of old paper and tobacco smoke from the floorboards. Commodore Perry Owens entered the room with his usual measured gait, his long hair tied back and his frock coat brushed clean of dust. He stood before the jury and delivered his testimony in a flat, monotone voice, stripping the event of any emotional weight or narrative flourish. He described the service of the warrant, the refusal of the suspect to comply, and the subsequent discharge of his firearm in response to a lethal threat. He did not ask for the jury's sympathy or justification. He presented the facts as a series of unavoidable physical interactions. The jury listened to the accounts of several townspeople who had witnessed the event from the safety of the nearby boardwalks. They heard about the speed with which the sheriff had neutralized the threat and the lack of hesitation in his movements. One witness described the way the dirt had kicked up behind Mose Roberts when he fell, and another spoke of the screams of Mary Blevins as she realized her youngest son was dead. The jurors, many of whom were shopkeepers and ranchers who had suffered under the intimidation of the Blevins gang, reached a verdict in less than 15 minutes. They ruled the deaths of Andy Blevins, Samuel Blevins, and Mose Roberts as justifiable homicide. This legal decision solidified the sheriff's authority, transforming the bloody event from a personal feud into an officially sanctioned act of territorial purification. The burial of the dead took place in the early afternoon at the Holbrook Cemetery, a desolate patch of ground defined by sun-bleached markers and stunted sagebrush. 3 pine boxes were transported to the site in a simple dray wagon, the wheels creaking under the weight of the raw lumber and the remains within. There was no funeral procession and no ringing of church bells. A small group of family members and a few curious onlookers stood by the open trenches as the boxes were lowered into the red earth. The sound of the first shovelfuls of dirt hitting the wood was a hollow thumping noise that echoed across the flats. Commodore did not attend the burials. He remained at the jail, his attention focused on the paperwork required to clear the warrants for the men he had just buried. The news of the shootout traveled through the telegraph wires with a speed that mirrored the violence of the act. Messages were sent to the territorial capital in Prescott and to the offices of the Aztec Land and Cattle Company. The wording of the dispatches was brief and clinical. Sheriff Owens served warrants on Blevins' gang. 3 dead, 1 wounded, sheriff unhurt. The brevity of the reports only served to fuel the growth of the legend. In the saloons of Albuquerque and Tucson, men spoke of the dandy who had walked into a hornet's nest and killed every man who reached for a gun. The story began to lose its gritty, literal details as it passed from person to person, but in Holbrook the reality remained a matter of blood and bone and the smell of death in the afternoon heat. Commodore spent the late afternoon tending to his horse. The animal had a deep groove in the muscle of its neck where John Blevins' errant shot had passed. The sheriff cleaned the wound with a solution of salt and warm water, his touch surprisingly gentle as he checked for signs of infection. The horse flinched but remained still, sensing the lack of aggression in the man. Commodore applied a thick layer of pine tar to the injury to keep the flies away and led the animal to a shaded stall. This was the only living creature that received any visible sign of concern from the lawman. To Commodore, the injury to the horse was a senseless complication caused by the incompetence of his enemies. He viewed the animal's pain as a debt that had been partially settled by the destruction of the Blevins family. The political atmosphere in Apache County shifted instantly following the inquest. The Board of Supervisors, who had been wary of the new sheriff's methods, now found themselves in a position where they had to support his results. The cattlemen and merchants who had previously paid protection money to the outlaws began to openly align themselves with the sheriff's office. They saw in Commodore a man who could be used to clear the path for expanded commerce and railroad development. Conversely, the supporters of the Blevins gang and the remnants of the rustling outfits moved into a state of quiet, dangerous seclusion. They did not attempt a direct retaliation, as the mechanical efficiency displayed at the cottage had convinced them that any confrontation with Owens would result in their immediate demise. The physical debris of the shootout remained at the cottage for several days. Mary Blevins, overwhelmed by the loss of her sons, began the process of packing the family's meager belongings. The house was riddled with holes where the .44-40 slugs had passed through the walls, and the floorboards in the entryway were permanently warped by the volume of blood they had absorbed. She moved through the rooms in a state of silent, focused grief, avoiding the areas where the violence had occurred. The local children, driven by a morbid curiosity, would sneak up to the fence to look for the bullet holes, their whispers falling silent when they saw the sheriff patrolling the street. The house became a monument to the end of an era, a structure that would eventually be torn down and replaced by the expanding footprint of the town. Inside the jail, the routine of law enforcement continued without interruption. Commodore did not allow the notoriety of the event to alter his behavior. He maintained his grooming habits with the same obsessive care, using a straight razor to keep his face smooth and a stiff brush to manage his long hair. He appeared in the streets of Holbrook wearing a clean shirt and polished boots, his silver-plated revolvers catching the afternoon sun. This consistency was a form of psychological dominance. It signaled to the community that the violence had not unraveled his discipline and that he remained a functional, lethal instrument of the law. He was a man who lived outside the emotional cadences of his peers, a biological anomaly in a world driven by passion and fear. The physician who had treated the wounded suffered from a state of exhaustion that was both physical and mental. Dr. George Robinson had seen his share of violence in the territory, but the clinical precision of the wounds inflicted by Owens was unlike anything he had previously encountered. He described the .44-40 projectiles as having a shattering effect on the human frame, turning solid bone into a powder and creating massive internal trauma that defied medical intervention. He spent his evenings writing his own notes on the cases, documenting the progress of the infection in Owens-Blevins and the complex fractures in John's arm. The doctor realized that the sheriff was not just a shooter. He was a man who understood the physics of lethality and applied them with a surgeon's lack of remorse. The local newspaper, the Holbrook Times, published a special edition detailing the events of the shootout and the results of the inquest. The editor used a sober, factual tone, avoiding the sensationalism that characterized the yellow journalism of the East. The article listed the names of the dead, the charges on the warrants, and the names of the coroner's jury. It concluded with a brief statement on the need for continued vigilance in the county. This publication served as the first formal history of the event, setting the narrative that would be used by future historians. Commodore read the article once and discarded it. He was not interested in how the world viewed his actions. He was only interested in the fact that the Blevins brothers no longer existed to steal horses or threaten the peace. The amount of blood on the porch had been so great that the owner of the house had to hire a laborer to scrub the wood with lye and sand. Even after hours of work, a dark, oblong shadow remained in the wood, marking the spot where Owens-Blevins had collapsed. The laborer worked in silence, his eyes darting toward the street every time he heard a horse approaching. He wanted to finish the task and distance himself from the property. To the people of Holbrook, that stain was a physical reminder of the thin line between order and chaos. It was a visual representation of the price of the sheriff's justice, a cost that everyone in the county was now forced to acknowledge. Commodore took his meals alone at the boarding house, sitting at a small table in the corner where he could observe the entrance and the windows. The other diners spoke in hushed tones when he was present, and the clinking of silverware on china was the only consistent sound in the room. He did not engage in conversation, and he did not linger over his food. He treated the act of eating as a biological necessity, a fueling of the machine for the next day's labor. He paid his bill with silver coins and walked out into the cooling air of the evening, his spurs making a crisp, metallic sound on the boardwalk. He was a man apart, a figure whose very presence enforced a standard of behavior that the town had never before known. The transition to the next phase of his tenure as sheriff involved a systematic expansion of his patrols. He began to move further south, into the rugged terrain of the Mogollon Rim where the remnants of the Pleasant Valley War still flickered. He knew that the victory in Holbrook was only a single engagement in a much larger conflict. He identified the supply lines and hideouts of the rustlers, using a network of Hispanic and Mormon informants to track their movements. He did not use large posses, preferring the stealth and mobility of a small, hand-picked group of deputies. His methods remained the same: identify the target, verify the warrant, and execute the service with a level of force that discouraged resistance. The specific ammunition Commodore used became a topic of discussion among the local gunsmiths. He used a heavy projectile with a flat nose designed to transfer the maximum amount of kinetic energy upon impact. He loaded his own cartridges, ensuring that each one had a uniform charge of black powder and a perfectly seated primer. He understood that a single misfire or a weak charge could mean the difference between a successful arrest and a shallow grave. This attention to the mechanical details of his profession was the foundation of his success. He did not rely on luck or bravado. He relied on the predictable laws of chemistry and physics. Mose Roberts was buried in a pauper's grave at the edge of the cemetery, his name recorded only in the county's burial ledger. There was no headstone to mark his location, and within a few months the desert winds had smoothed the dirt until it was indistinguishable from the surrounding landscape. He was the first of many who would vanish into the red dirt of Arizona under the sheriff's watch. The lack of a funeral or a marker was a testament to the lack of impact his life had on the territory beyond his final violent interaction with the law. He had become a footnote in the ledger of Commodore Perry Owens, a name crossed out in black ink. The psychological weight on the survivors in the Blevins house was manifested in the sudden, frantic departure of the family members who had not been involved in the shooting. They left under the cover of darkness, fearing that the sheriff might return with more warrants or that the townspeople might turn against them. They left behind the furniture and the blood-stained floorboards, taking only what they could carry on their horses. The cottage stood empty for several months, its windows reflecting the barren landscape and the passing trains. It was a skeletal reminder of a family that had tried to bully a county and had been broken by a single man with a Winchester. As the day of September 5th drew to a close, the temperature in Holbrook dropped, and a cold wind began to blow from the north. Commodore stood on the porch of the jail looking out over the town he had just redefined. He could see the lights of the saloons and the glowing windows of the houses where families were eating their evening meals in peace. He felt no sense of pride or accomplishment. He felt only the cold, steady focus that had sustained him since he left Tennessee. He had performed his duty, and the world was slightly more orderly because of it. He turned and walked back into the jail, the door closing with a solid, mechanical click that signaled the end of the day. The aftermath of the Holbrook shootout was not a period of reconciliation, but a period of consolidation. The dandy sheriff had demonstrated that the law in Apache County was no longer a matter of opinion or political influence. It was a matter of terminal velocity and mechanical reliability. The people of the territory had seen the gritty reality of the new order, and they were prepared to live within its boundaries. Commodore Perry Owens sat at his desk, the light of a single lamp illuminating the warrants that still needed to be served. He picked up his pen and began to write, the scratching of the nib the only sound in the room as he prepared for the next confrontation in the sun-scorched reaches of the Old West. July 13th, 1888. The high-altitude winds of the Mogollon Rim roared through the dense stands of ponderosa pine, creating a constant, low-frequency hum that vibrated through the limestone bedrock beneath Commodore Perry Owens' boots. This massive geological escarpment served as the southern boundary of his jurisdiction, a jagged wall of basalt and sandstone that dropped 2,000 feet into the Tonto Basin. The air at 7,000 feet was thin and smelled of resin and damp earth, a sharp contrast to the alkaline dust of the Holbrook Flats. Owens sat on a fallen log, his silver-mounted revolvers resting against his thighs, while he adjusted the tension on his saddle cinch. He was far from the administrative comforts of the county seat, deep in a region where the remnants of the Pleasant Valley War still sought refuge in the inaccessible canyons and hidden meadows. His presence here was a physical manifestation of the county's expanding reach, a warning to the scattered survivors of the Graham and Tewksbury feud that the era of private warfare was over. The terrain of the rim was a labyrinth of vertical relief and dense undergrowth that favored the fugitive over the lawman. Commodore spent his days navigating the narrow deer trails that skirted the edges of the abyss, his eyes constantly scanning the dark spaces between the tree trunks for the unnatural glimmer of a rifle barrel or the movement of a horse. He had traded his frock coat for a shorter, more practical canvas jacket, but his long hair remained a dark, flowing mane that he brushed with a silver-backed comb every morning. This commitment to his appearance was a tactical choice. It reinforced his status as a man who remained unyielding in the face of environmental chaos. He moved with a silence that mirrored the mountain lions that prowled the same ridges, his horse trained to step over deadfall without snapping the brittle pine branches. The political pressure from the northern precincts of Apache County had intensified as the cattle markets began to stabilize. The investors in the Aztec Land and Cattle Company demanded the complete eradication of the rustling syndicates that utilized the Mogollon Rim as a staging ground for their raids. Commodore responded by launching a series of solitary patrols that lasted for weeks at a time. He lived on a diet of dried venison and coffee brewed from snowmelt, his body becoming a lean, corded engine of pursuit. He did not trust the local deputies in the mountain towns, many of whom had family ties to the warring factions of the basin. He preferred the clarity of his own observations and the reliability of his Winchester, a weapon that had become a physical extension of his moral code. One specific target of his pursuit was a group of 3 men who had been associated with the Cooper-Blevins faction and were now operating as independent stock thieves. They had established a camp in a secluded draw near the headwaters of the Little Colorado River, believing the dense timber would provide a permanent shield. Commodore tracked them for 4 days, reading the displacement of pine needles and the depth of the hoof prints in the soft volcanic soil. He did not rush the confrontation. He waited for the temperature to drop and for the men to huddle around their fire, their senses dulled by the cold and the physical exhaustion of their trade. He positioned himself on a limestone ledge 60 yards above the camp, the cold steel of his rifle barrel resting on a flat stone. The mechanical process of the ambush was clinical and devoid of the theatricality found in the pulp novels of the era. Commodore watched the men for 2 hours, identifying the leader and the placement of their weapons. When the leader stood up to throw another log on the fire, the sheriff squeezed the trigger. The .44-40 projectile struck the man in the upper chest, the force of the impact throwing him backward into the embers. The remaining 2 men scrambled for their rifles, but Commodore worked the lever of his Winchester with a rhythmic, mechanical speed that allowed no room for a counterattack. A second shot shattered the stock of a rifle just as it was being raised, and a third projectile grazed the shoulder of the youngest outlaw, sending him into a state of immediate shock. The fight ended as quickly as it had begun, the smell of gunpowder mixing with the scent of charred cedar. Commodore descended the slope with a measured, rhythmic stride, his rifle still at his shoulder. He did not offer words of comfort or anger to the survivors. He disarmed them with a practiced efficiency, using leather thongs to bind their wrists behind their backs. The wounded youth was sobbing, the copper smell of his own blood triggering a frantic animal terror. But the sheriff ignored the emotional display. He gathered the stolen horses and the men's equipment, preparing for the long ride back to the jail in Holbrook. The physical reality of the situation was one of grinding labor, hauling the body of the dead man across a pack saddle and ensuring the prisoners did not collapse during the ascent back to the rim. Commodore performed these tasks with a detachment that bordered on the mechanical, his focus entirely on the logistics of the transport. The nights on the rim were brutal, with temperatures frequently dropping below the freezing point even in the middle of summer. Commodore slept in short 30-minute intervals, his back against a tree and his rifle across his knees. He used the cold as a tool to keep the prisoners subdued, knowing that their lack of adequate clothing would prevent them from attempting an escape in the darkness. He watched the stars through the canopy of the pines, his mind tracking the movement of the constellations with the same precision he used to track a fugitive. He felt no sense of companionship with the men he had captured. They were merely administrative units that needed to be processed through the legal system. His solitude was absolute, a self-imposed isolation that allowed him to function at a level of lethality that other men could not sustain. By the time the party reached the outskirts of the settlements, the physical toll on the prisoners was evident in their gray skin and their vacant, staring eyes. Commodore, however, appeared as if he had just stepped out of a hotel. His hair was neat, his clothes were remarkably clean, and his posture was as upright as the day he left Navajo Springs. This contrast was a source of profound unease for the townspeople who witnessed his arrival. They saw a man who had spent a month in the most rugged terrain of the territory and emerged without a single sign of weakness. The rumors of his supernatural endurance began to circulate through the saloons of St. John's, adding a layer of myth to his already formidable reputation. He was the Iron Man of the Rim, a title he accepted with a neutral nod and a return to his paperwork. The legal proceedings following the capture were swift and followed the established patterns of the county court. Commodore delivered his testimony with his usual lack of flourish, detailing the mechanical sequence of the shots and the recovery of the stolen property. He did not mention the cold or the hunger or the sound of the wind in the trees. He focused on the facts that would ensure a conviction, treating the courtroom as another environment where precision was the only currency. The surviving outlaws were sentenced to long terms in the territorial prison at Yuma, a place where the heat was as lethal as the cold of the Mogollon Rim. Commodore watched them being loaded onto the train, his eyes showing no more emotion than if he were watching a shipment of cattle. The physical environment of the county was changing as the decade drew to a close. The arrival of the sheep industry in the southern districts created a new set of tensions that Commodore had to manage. The sheepmen, often Hispanic or Mormon, found themselves in direct competition for the grazing lands with the established cattle kings. This conflict, known as the Sheep and Cattle War, threatened to plunge the county back into a state of lawless violence. Commodore approached this new challenge with a rigid impartiality that frustrated both sides. He did not care about the species of the livestock. He cared only about the validity of the land claims and the prevention of bloodshed. He rode between the camps of the rival factions, his presence alone often sufficient to prevent a skirmish. His digestive issues, a result of the mineral-heavy water of his youth, began to manifest with a greater frequency during the long patrols. He suffered from sharp, cramping pains that would have immobilized a less disciplined man, but he never allowed his physical discomfort to affect his performance. He developed a habit of drinking small amounts of peppermint oil to soothe his stomach, the scent of the herb often preceding his arrival in a town. This detail became another part of his legend, the sheriff who smelled of peppermint and death. He viewed his body as a machine that was beginning to show signs of wear, but he intended to run it until the final bolt sheared off. He did not seek medical advice, preferring to manage his ailments with the same stoic independence that defined his law enforcement. The interior of the sheriff's office in Holbrook became a sanctuary of order amidst the chaos of the territory. Commodore spent his evenings organizing the county's records, creating a systematic filing system for the warrants and the tax rolls. He was a meticulous bookkeeper, ensuring that every cent of the county's money was accounted for and that every legal document was filed correctly. This administrative precision was just as vital to his success as his marksmanship. It prevented his enemies from challenging his authority in the courts and provided him with a clear picture of the criminal activity within his borders. He was a man of the ledger as much as he was a man of the gun. In the autumn of 1888, he was involved in a standoff with a group of drunk cowboys who had taken over a general store in Snowflake. The men were armed and were threatening to burn the building down if their demands for more whiskey were not met. Commodore arrived alone, his Winchester held in the crook of his arm. He did not yell or issue threats. He simply stood in the middle of the street and watched the building. After an hour of silence, the leader of the group stepped out onto the porch to see why the law was not attacking. He saw the sheriff leaning against a hitching rail, his eyes fixed on the door with an unblinking focus. The cowboy, recognizing the man from the stories of the Holbrook Shootout, dropped his gun and surrendered. The power of Commodore's reputation had reached a point where he no longer needed to fire his weapon to achieve a result. The physical reality of the Old West was one of constant grinding transition. The open range was being subdivided by miles of barbed wire, and the arrival of the telephone was beginning to link the isolated towns of Apache County. Commodore viewed these changes with a neutral curiosity. He understood that the era of the individual gunfighter was being replaced by the era of the technician, and he adjusted his methods accordingly. He began to use the telegraph to coordinate his movements with the sheriffs of neighboring counties, creating a net that made it increasingly difficult for fugitives to cross the territorial borders. He was no longer a solitary hunter. He was becoming the central node of a regional security network. The injury to his horse's neck had healed into a thick, hairless scar that remained sensitive to the touch. Commodore continued to ride the animal, but he was careful to use a different style of headstall that did not irritate the sight. The horse had become his most reliable companion, the only entity that shared the silence of the long mountain patrols. He spent more on the animal's feed and care than he did on his own sustenance, a rare display of sentimentality that he kept hidden from the public. To the citizens of Holbrook, he was a man without heart or heat. But in the solitude of the Mogollon Rim, he was a man who understood the value of a loyal creature in a world defined by human betrayal. As 1888 turned into 1889, the results of Commodore's tenure were undeniable. The murder rate in Apache County had dropped by 70%, and the organized rustling gangs had either been destroyed or forced to relocate to the more lawless regions of New Mexico. The people of the territory lived with a sense of security that had been absent for a generation. They knew that if they were victimized, the dandy sheriff would eventually arrive at the offender's door with a warrant and a Winchester. This certainty was the foundation of the new order, a peace established not through negotiation but through the consistent application of lethal force. Commodore began to plan for the eventual end of his term. He knew that the political winds were shifting and that the very effectiveness of his methods would eventually make him obsolete. A county that was safe and orderly no longer required a man who operated with the intensity of a soldier. He looked toward the west, toward the town of Seligman and the promise of a life that did not involve the constant threat of violence. He thought about opening a business, perhaps a general store or a saloon where he could utilize his administrative skills without the need for a badge. But for now, he remained the sheriff of Apache County, the guardian of the Mogollon Rim, and the man whose shadow stretched long across the history of Arizona. The physical toll of the year was visible in the way he stood when he thought no one was watching. He would lean heavily on his rifle, his shoulders drooping for a few seconds before he snapped back into his rigid, upright posture. The constant alertness required to survive in the mountains was beginning to fray his nerves, creating a state of hypervigilance that made it impossible for him to relax even in the safety of his own office. He saw threats in every shadow and heard the sound of a hammer cocking in every snap of a dry twig. He was a man who had become so well adapted to the violence of his world that he was becoming unfit for the peace he was creating. The narrative of his time on the rim is a story of a man who pursued a specific vision of justice to its logical, bloody conclusion. He did not seek glory or wealth. He sought the mechanical perfection of an ordered society. He used his Winchester to clear the forests of predators and his ledger to clear the towns of corruption. He was a figure of absolute consistency in a landscape of shifting loyalties, a man whose long hair and silver revolvers became symbols of a law that could not be broken. He stood at the edge of the abyss and looked down, and he did not flinch, for he knew that he was the only thing standing between the people of Apache County and the darkness that lived in the canyons. The final paragraph of the year 1888 finds Commodore Perry Owens back in Holbrook, sitting on the porch of the jail as the first snow of winter begins to fall. The flakes are large and wet, melting as they hit the warm wood of the boardwalk. He watches the town grow quiet under the white blanket, the sounds of the railroad muffled by the cold. He is 36 years old and he has killed more men than he can easily count, yet his hands are steady and his eyes are clear. He picks up his Winchester and walks inside, the click of the lock signaling the end of another day in the service of the law. The long shadow of the Mogollon Rim has followed him home, a reminder of the price he has paid and the legacy he will leave behind. January 1st, 1895. The iron locomotive of the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad hissed steam into the freezing morning air of Seligman, Arizona, a town that functioned as a vital junction for the westward expansion. Commodore Perry Owens stood on the platform, the silver badge of a United States deputy marshal pinned to his coat, reflecting the harsh winter light. The territory had moved beyond the localized chaos of individual county disputes, and Owens now operated under a federal mandate that spanned the entirety of the Southwest. His role had shifted from the immediate violence of the sheriff's office to the more calculated, legalistic pursuit of fugitives across territorial lines. The long hair that had defined his youth remained, though it now contained threads of silver that matched the metal of his badge and his revolvers. He moved with a stiff precision, his joints reacting to the damp cold of the high desert, a physical manifestation of 2 decades spent in the saddle. The town of Seligman was a product of industrial necessity, a collection of timber and stone buildings huddled against the relentless traffic of the railroad. Owens had recognized the shifting economic winds and had begun to invest his savings into property within the town limits. He transitioned from a man who lived in the wilderness to a man who owned a portion of the civilization he had helped to establish. He opened a general store and eventually a saloon, applying the same mechanical organization to his inventory that he had once applied to his ammunition supplies. He tracked every crate of dry goods and every barrel of whiskey with a meticulous hand, his ledger books filled with the neat, cramped script of a man who tolerated no discrepancies. He was no longer just a gunfighter. He was a merchant marshal, a figure who occupied the intersection of law and commerce. His work as a federal officer in the 1890s was less about dramatic shootouts and more about the grinding persistence of the hunt. He spent weeks traveling by rail and horse to serve warrants in the remote mining camps of the Hualapai Mountains and the isolated ranches along the Colorado River. The criminals he pursued were a different breed from the Blevins gang. They were forgers, train robbers, and smugglers who utilized the infrastructure of the modernizing West to hide their tracks. Commodore adapted his methods, utilizing the telegraph to coordinate with other marshals and using the railroad to move faster than his prey. He remained a solitary figure, often arriving in a town unannounced and departing just as quietly once the prisoner was in irons. His reputation preceded him, ensuring that many suspects surrendered rather than face the Winchester that had ended the careers of so many before them. The physical toll of his lifestyle was becoming impossible to ignore as he approached his mid-40s. The stomach pains that had plagued him since his days at Navajo Springs had evolved into a chronic burning discomfort that radiated into his lower back. He frequently experienced bouts of extreme fatigue and a persistent thirst that no amount of water could satisfy. These were the early symptoms of Bright's disease, a condition that attacked the kidneys and slowly drained the vitality from the body. Commodore managed the pain with a stoic silence, refusing to acknowledge the encroachment of illness. He viewed his failing health as a mechanical defect in his biology, something to be managed through discipline and the continued application of his will. He avoided the doctors in Seligman, distrusting their tonics and their professional curiosity about his history. The environment of the general store provided a different kind of sensory experience from the open range. Instead of the scent of sagebrush and horse sweat, he was surrounded by the smell of roasted coffee, raw wool, and the metallic tang of tinned goods. He stood behind the counter with his back to the wall, his eyes never leaving the entrance as customers entered and exited. He was a man who had become so well adapted to the threat of ambush that he could no longer sit in a room without scanning for points of egress and cover. The townspeople treated him with a mixture of reverence and extreme caution, their conversations falling to a whisper when he walked past. He was a living landmark, a piece of the territory's violent past that was now selling them flour and nails. In 1896, he was called upon to assist in the capture of a group of express car robbers who had derailed a train near Peach Springs. The robbers had utilized dynamite to breach the safe, creating a scene of twisted metal and charred paper. Commodore tracked the group through a series of limestone canyons, his horse picking its way through the debris of an ancient volcanic flow. He found the men huddled in a cave, their confidence shattered by the realization that the dandy marshal was on their trail. There was no shootout. Owens simply positioned himself at the mouth of the cave and informed the men that he had all the time in the world and enough ammunition to last a month. The suspects emerged with their hands raised, their eyes fixed on the long-haired man who looked more like a specter than a lawman. His partnership with James Banta in the business world was a study in professional distance. Banta handled the more social aspects of the trade, while Commodore focused on the logistics and the security of their investments. They operated several ventures in Seligman, including a saloon that became a focal point for the railroad workers and the local ranchers. Commodore did not drink with the customers, nor did he participate in the gambling that took place at the back tables. He sat in a chair near the bar, his Winchester leaning against his knee, his presence acting as a permanent dampener on the volatility of the crowd. He did not need to raise his voice to maintain order. The mere sight of his silver-plated revolvers was sufficient to remind the patrons of the consequences of disorder. The interior of his living quarters above the store was a reflection of his solitary nature. The room was sparsely furnished, containing a bed, a washstand, and a desk where he kept his federal reports. He spent his evenings grooming his hair and maintaining his firearms, the rhythmic clicking of the gun parts the only sound in the small space. He had no family and no close associates, having spent his entire adult life building a wall of professional detachment. The isolation that had served him so well in the mountains of Apache County was now a permanent feature of his existence in the town. He was a man who had forgotten how to interact with the world in any way that did not involve the mechanics of the law or the transactions of business. The year 1897 brought an influx of new settlers to the region, people who had no first-hand knowledge of the violence of the 1880s. To them, Commodore was an eccentricity, a man who belonged in a museum or a circus. They asked him questions about the Blevins house and the number of men he had killed. Questions that he answered with a cold, unblinking silence. He had no interest in being a hero for the entertainment of others. He viewed his past actions as a series of necessary removals, a cleaning of the landscape that allowed these newcomers to live in safety. Their lack of understanding was a testament to his success, but it also emphasized his status as a relic of a world that was rapidly vanishing under the weight of the 20th century. The physical reality of Seligman was defined by the constant vibration of the passing trains. The ground shook as the heavy locomotives pulled their loads of cattle and ore toward the coast, the sound of the steam whistles a permanent backdrop to every conversation. Commodore found a strange comfort in the predictability of the railroad schedule. It was a manifestation of the order he craved, a mechanical system that operated according to strict laws and timings. He would stand on the platform and watch the trains pass, his mind calculating the tonnage and the speed with which the territory was being integrated into the national economy. He understood that his role as a gunfighter had been to clear the way for this infrastructure, and he felt a grim satisfaction in the result. His health continued to decline as 1898 approached. The swelling in his legs made it difficult to wear his boots for extended periods, and he was forced to purchase a larger size to accommodate the edema. He began to delegate more of the field work to younger deputies, men who possessed the physical stamina that he was losing. He felt a profound frustration at the betrayal of his own body. Viewing the illness as an enemy he could not shoot or intimidate, he maintained his rigid posture through sheer force of will, refusing to allow the townspeople to see him limp or stumble. He remained the dandy, his clothes perfectly tailored and his hair impeccably brushed, even as the internal systems of his body began to fail. The outbreak of the Spanish-American War in 1898 created a surge of patriotic fervor in the territory. Many young men from Seligman and Holbrook joined the Rough Riders, seeking the glory and adventure that they associated with the frontier legends. Commodore watched them depart with a cynical detachment. He knew that war was not about glory. It was about the brutal mechanical reality of metal meeting flesh. He had seen the results of combat up close, and he knew that these boys were entering a world where their romantic notions would be shredded by the first volley of fire. He stayed in Seligman, continuing his work as a marshal and a businessman, a man who had already fought his war and had the scars to prove it. The transition of the gunfighter into the 20th century was a process of slow, quiet erasure. The headlines in the newspapers were no longer about stagecoach robberies and Indian raids. They were about international politics, scientific discoveries, and the rise of the automobile. Commodore Perry Owens was a name that appeared less and less frequently in the public record. He was becoming a figure of the past, a ghost that walked the boardwalks of a modern town. He did not seek to reclaim his notoriety, preferring the quiet anonymity of his business ventures. He was content to be a merchant, to be a man who provided the tools of survival to others while his own survival became a matter of medical attrition. His relationship with Elizabeth Jane Barrett, whom he would eventually marry, began as a series of quiet interactions in the store. She was a woman who did not seem intimidated by his reputation or his silence. She treated him with a straightforward dignity that he found unsettling but ultimately appealing. Their courtship was devoid of the typical romantic flourishes, consisting of shared meals and long periods of comfortable silence. She became the first person in his life who was allowed to see the man behind the badge, the person who suffered from the chronic pain and the weight of his memories. She provided a sense of stability that had been absent from his existence since he left his father's house in Tennessee. The physical environment of his store was a microcosm of the territory's development. He sold barbed wire to the ranchers who were fencing in the range, and he sold mechanical parts to the miners who were deep in the mountains. He was the provider of the materials that were used to dismantle the wild world he had once hunted in. He felt no irony in this role. He viewed it as the logical progression of his duty. He had broken the outlaws so that the fences could be built, and now he was selling the wire. He was a man who understood the life cycle of the frontier, from the first shot fired in the desert to the last transaction made in a town store. By 1899, the symptoms of his disease were a constant presence. He experienced frequent headaches and a blurring of his vision that made it difficult to read his ledgers. He began to move more slowly, his every action a calculated expenditure of energy. He sold his interest in the saloon, finding the noise and the volatility of the patrons to be an unnecessary drain on his dwindling reserves. He focused his remaining strength on the general store and his duties as a marshal, determined to remain a functional member of society until the very end. He did not complain about the pain, and he did not seek the pity of his neighbors. He remained the Iron Man, though the iron was now brittle and pitted by time. The final days of the 19th century saw Commodore Perry Owens as a man of significant property and a respected, if feared, member of the community. He had successfully navigated the transition from the lawless frontier to the regulated modern world, a feat that few of his contemporaries had achieved. Most of the men who had stood with him or against him in the 1870s and 80s were dead, either by the gun or by the harsh conditions of the territory. He was one of the last survivors of a vanished era, a man who carried the history of Arizona in the scars on his hands and the silver in his hair. He looked toward the new century with a neutral gaze, ready for whatever changes it would bring. The physical reality of the New Year's Eve in 1899 was one of cold, clear skies and the distant sound of celebrations from the railroad workers. Commodore sat in his store, the light of a single kerosene lamp illuminating the room. He had just finished the year-end inventory and the books were perfectly balanced. He picked up his Winchester and checked the action, the mechanical click sounding sharp in the silence. He thought about the miles he had ridden and the men he had killed, and he felt a sense of completion. The world was no longer the place it had been when he left Tennessee, and he was no longer the boy who had fled his father's lash. He was a man who had shaped his own destiny with a rifle and a ledger. The narrative of his transition is a story of a man who understood the value of adaptation. He did not try to hold on to a past that was already gone. He found a way to be relevant in the present. He traded the anonymity of the drifter for the responsibility of the businessman and the violence of the sheriff for the authority of the marshal. He remained a dandy, not out of vanity, but out of a commitment to the discipline that had kept him alive. He was a figure of absolute consistency in a world of constant change, a man whose presence in Seligman was a reminder that the peace of the new century had been bought with the blood of the old. As the clock struck midnight and 1900 began, Commodore Perry Owens stood up and walked to the window. He looked out at the lights of the town and the silhouettes of the passing trains, his expression neutral. He felt the familiar ache in his kidneys and the thirst in his throat, but he did not move to address them. He stood as he had always stood, upright and focused, a silent guardian of a world that no longer needed him to be a killer. He had finished his ledger, and he was ready for the final chapters of his life. The dandy sheriff had become the Seligman merchant, and the transition of the gunfighter was complete. April 30th, 1902. The cool air of Los Angeles pressed against the windows of the room where Commodore Perry Owens stood beside Elizabeth Jane Barrett to formalize their union. At 49 years of age, the former sheriff presented a figure of disciplined composure, his dark frock coat fitting tightly across shoulders that had begun to stoop from decades of tension. Elizabeth was a woman of practical temperament, providing a stark contrast to the solitary, violent trajectory of Owens' earlier life. The ceremony was a brief, legalistic affair, devoid of the exuberant celebrations common in the territory. Owens signed the marriage certificate with the same precise mechanical script he had used for 1,000 warrants, his fingers gripping the pen with a strength that belied the growing tremors in his hands. This transition into domestic life marked the final redirection of a man who had spent 30 years as a human barrier between civilization and the vacuum of the desert. The town of Seligman functioned as a grit-choked hub for the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway, an environment defined by the constant rhythmic thumping of steam pistons and the screech of iron wheels on steel tracks. Owens had moved away from the active pursuit of fugitives to focus on the management of his mercantile interests and his duties as a local official. The store he operated was a rectangular structure of timber and stone, its interior smelling of unwashed wool, cured tobacco, and the metallic tang of hardware. He spent his mornings behind a counter of polished oak, tracking the flow of inventory with an obsessive attention to detail. He treated every transaction as a tactical exercise, ensuring that the exchange of coin for goods was performed with a clinical accuracy that left no room for the social nuances of small-town commerce. Physical decline began to manifest in the way Owens navigated the boardwalks of the town. The chronic inflammation of his kidneys, a condition known to the local physicians as Bright's disease, created a persistent, dull ache in the small of his back that radiated through his hips. His legs often retained fluid, causing a visible swelling that made the act of pulling on his high-topped boots a painful 30-minute ordeal every dawn. Despite this internal decay, he maintained the dandy exterior with a ferocity that bordered on the irrational. He brushed his long hair for an hour each morning, the silver strands now outnumbering the dark ones, and he ensured his linen shirts were starched to a razor-like stiffness. He viewed the maintenance of his appearance as a defensive measure, a way to signal to the world that the machine was still operational, even as the internal gears were grinding to a halt. Elizabeth managed the domestic sphere with a quiet efficiency that respected Owen's need for silence. Their home was a place of predictable routines and sparse decoration, reflecting the utilitarian mindset of its owner. The meals she prepared were bland and soft, designed to accommodate the digestive distress that had become a permanent feature of Owen's existence. He ate with a rhythmic mechanical motion, his eyes often fixed on the door or the window, a residual habit from years of expecting an ambush. He did not discuss the violence of Apache County or the men he had buried in the red dirt of Holbrook. To him, those events were completed files, data points in a ledger that had been closed and shelved. He preferred to discuss the price of wholesale grain or the arrival schedule of the westbound freight trains. The social atmosphere of Seligman was one of distant respect for the aging lawman. The younger men, those who had arrived in the territory after the railroads had effectively tamed the landscape, viewed Owens as a living artifact. They watched him walk from his house to the store, noting the silver-plated revolvers that still sat in their holsters, though the leather was now cracked and worn. They saw the way he scanned a room when he entered, his unblinking gaze moving from face to face with a predatory focus that made the hair on their necks stand up. He did not seek their company, and he did not participate in the casual storytelling of the saloons. He remained a man apart, a biological anomaly who had survived a world they only knew through the exaggerated prose of dime novels. The environment around the town was a landscape of volcanic cinders and stunted junipers, a high desert plateau that offered no shelter from the winds that roared off the Colorado Plateau. Owens found a strange comfort in the harshness of the weather. He would sit on the porch of his store during the spring gales, the dust coating his boots and the grit filling the creases of his face. He watched the horizon with a patience that was purely mechanical, his mind untroubled by the lack of human interaction. He was a creature of the earth and the wind, a man who had been stripped of his social instincts by the necessity of survival. The noise of the town, the shouting of the teamsters and the clanging of the railroad shops was merely background static to his internal silence. The internal reality of his illness was a constant grinding struggle against the betrayal of his own biology. The metallic taste of urea in his mouth and the persistent, unquenchable thirst were physical reminders that his time was finite. He drank gallons of water every day, the liquid passing through his system without providing relief. He experienced frequent headaches that felt like iron spikes being driven into his temples, yet he never allowed a grimace to touch his face. He treated the pain as a technical problem to be managed through discipline. He refused the offers of the local doctor to provide opium or other sedatives, fearing that the loss of his mental clarity would make him vulnerable. He chose to meet his end with the same cold, unblinking focus with which he had met Owens-Blevins. In 1906, the arrival of the first automobiles in Seligman signaled the definitive end of the horse-based culture Owens had mastered. He watched the chugging, unreliable machines with a neutral curiosity, recognizing them as the next iteration of the mechanical order he respected. He did not purchase one, preferring the predictable gait of his horse, but he understood that the geography of the West was being compressed by internal combustion. The trails he had once tracked fugitives upon were being graded into roads, and the canyons that had hidden outlaw gangs were being mapped by surveyors and engineers. He was a man who had cleared the brush so that the pavement could be laid, and he watched the transformation without a hint of nostalgia or regret. His relationship with the town's children was one of mutual observation. They would follow him at a distance, whispered dares passing between them as they tried to get a closer look at his long hair and his revolvers. Owens never spoke to them, but he was aware of their presence. Occasionally, if a child ventured too close, he would turn his head and lock his gaze on them for a single, terrifying second. The child would inevitably flee, sensing the cold lethality that still lived behind the sheriff's eyes. He did not harbor any malice toward the youth. He simply had no functional way to interact with them. He was a man who had been built for combat, and he had no place in the world of play or innocence. The physical inventory of his store provided a detailed record of the changing needs of the territory. He sold more rolls of barbed wire than boxes of ammunition, and more canned peaches than sacks of dried beans. The settlers were no longer looking for the tools of the hunter. They were looking for the tools of the farmer and the merchant. Owens managed the books with a mathematical precision that ensured the financial stability of his household. He owned several lots in town and held interests in local mining ventures, his wealth growing as the territory moved toward statehood. He was a successful man by every metric of the new century, yet he remained as isolated and detached as he had been on the day he left Tennessee. The winds of 1912 brought the news of Arizona's admission to the Union as the 48th state. The celebration in Seligman was boisterous, with the firing of anvils and the ringing of bells. Owens watched the festivities from the doorway of his store, his expression neutral. To him, statehood was merely the formalization of a process he had initiated decades earlier. The law was no longer a matter of personal proficiency with a Winchester. It was now a matter of statutes, committees, and bureaucratic oversight. He felt no desire to participate in the new political order. He had done the bloody work required to make the statehood possible, and he was content to let the men in suits handle the administration of the peace he had bought. Elizabeth noticed the deepening of the shadows under his eyes and the way his hands shook when he attempted to groom his hair. She began to take over the daily maintenance of his wardrobe and the cleaning of his hair, her fingers moving through the long silver locks with a gentleness he had never known. He allowed this intimacy, the only crack in his armor of self-reliance. In the quiet of their bedroom, away from the gaze of the town, he was no longer the Iron Man of Apache County. He was a fragile, aging man who was being slowly hollowed out by a disease that had no cure. He would sit in a chair by the window, watching the moonlight on the volcanic ridges, his breathing shallow and labored. The specific symptoms of the kidney failure became more aggressive as the decade progressed. He suffered from bouts of nausea that made it impossible to keep down the bland food Elizabeth prepared. His skin took on a waxy, translucent quality, and he was forced to use a cane to navigate the short distance between his house and the store. He hated the cane, viewing it as a physical admission of weakness. But his balance had been compromised by the swelling in his feet and the persistent dizziness. He still wore his revolvers, though the weight of the metal now felt like a burden rather than a comfort. He was a man who was being dismantled piece by piece, a mechanical failure that was playing out in slow motion before the eyes of the community. Occasional visitors from his past would stop in Seligman, men who had ridden with him in the 80s or who had seen him at the Blevins house. They found a man who was a shell of his former self, yet whose spirit remained as cold and hard as a winter morning. They did not stay long, as the silence of Owens' company was more oppressive than the memories of the violence they had shared. He did not ask about the health of mutual acquaintances, and he did not reminisce about the gunfights. He would nod a greeting, offer a stiff hand, and wait for them to depart. He had no interest in the past. He was focused entirely on the mechanical struggle of his own survival. The year 1915 was a period of intense physical suffering. The pain in his back was now a constant stabbing sensation that made sleep impossible. He would spend his nights pacing the floor of the parlor, his spurs making a ghostly, rhythmic sound on the wood. He used the repetitive motion of cleaning his firearms to distract his mind from the agony. He would disassemble the Winchester, oil the parts, and reassemble it over and over until the sun rose over the eastern plateau. The mechanical logic of the rifle was the only thing that made sense in a world that was dissolving into a haze of pain and fatigue. He was a man who was holding on to his sanity through the sheer force of his habits. Elizabeth's presence became the only anchor in his increasingly fractured reality. She did not offer empty words of hope or try to minimize the severity of his condition. She remained a steady, functional partner who provided the care he needed without the burden of emotional demand. She understood that Owens was a man who could not be comforted in the traditional sense. He needed to be respected, and he needed his dignity to remain intact. She ensured that he was always clean, always dressed in his best clothes, and always positioned so that he could see the door. She was the guardian of his legacy, protecting the dandy image from the indignities of his failing health. The town of Seligman continued to grow around them, the population increasing as the railroad expanded its operations. The old-timers were dying off, replaced by a generation that viewed the frontier as a romantic myth rather than a literal experience. The stories of Commodore Perry Owens were being sanitized and simplified for the consumption of the public. He was becoming a caricature, a figure of pulp fiction who existed in a world of black and white. Owens ignored the growing legend, finding the public's fascination with his past to be a nuisance. He did not care about his place in history. He only cared about the accuracy of his ledgers and the readiness of his weapons. The physical environment of the high desert remained a constant source of sensory input. The scent of the rain on the dry earth, the sharp taste of the winter air, and the blinding glare of the summer sun were the only things that felt real to him. He would sit on his porch for hours, watching the shadows move across the basalt cliffs, his mind a void. He was transitioning from a man of action to a man of observation, his senses sharpening as his physical capabilities declined. He noticed the smallest details, the flight pattern of a hawk, the movement of a lizard in the dust, the way the light changed before a storm. He was becoming a part of the landscape he had once dominated. The year 1917 brought the news of the United States' entry into the Great War in Europe. Owens watched the young men of Seligman board the trains to head for the training camps, their faces filled with the same arrogant confidence he had seen in the Blevins gang. He knew that they were moving toward a level of industrial violence that made the gunfights of the frontier look like minor skirmishes. He saw the transition from the individual marksman to the mass-produced soldier, and he understood that the world he represented was being permanently buried. He felt no desire to participate in the conflict, recognizing that he was a relic of a different era of warfare. The final months of 1918 were a period of extreme isolation as the Spanish flu epidemic swept through the territory. Owens and Elizabeth remained in their home, avoiding contact with the townspeople. The disease claimed many of the younger residents of Seligman, but Owens' compromised system somehow managed to avoid the infection. He watched the funeral processions from his window, a grim parade of pine boxes that mirrored the aftermath of the Holbrook Shootout. The scent of the carbolic acid and the sight of the masked physicians were a visceral reminder of the fragility of human life. He felt no fear of the virus, viewing death as an inevitable mechanical failure that would eventually claim him regardless of the cause. His hair had turned completely white by this time, a long, snowy mane that cascaded over his thin shoulders. He was a spectral figure, a man of bone and silver who seemed to be held together by his clothes and his will alone. He could no longer walk to the store, and he spent his days in a chair by the hearth, the warmth of the fire providing the only relief for his aching joints. He still insisted on wearing his revolvers, the weight of the steel a familiar pressure against his hips. He was waiting for the final shutter to close, his mind clear and his focus unwavering. He had lived his life according to a rigid, uncompromising code, and he intended to finish it the same way. The transition from the quiet years to the final months was a slow, agonizing process of erosion. The world outside his window continued to change. The noise of the 19th century replaced by the mechanical roar of the 20th. Owens sat in the silence of his home, a man who had outlived his era and his enemies. He looked at Elizabeth, who was sitting across from him mending a shirt, and felt a rare surge of gratitude. She had been the only person who had walked beside him without trying to change him. She was the final transaction in a life of cold, hard bargains, and she was the only one that had provided a true profit. As the sun set on the final day of 1918, Commodore Perry Owens closed his eyes and listened to the sound of the wind in the chimney. He felt the familiar pain in his kidneys and the thirst in his throat, but they felt distant now, as if they belonged to another man. He was a finished product, a mechanical entity that had performed its function and was now ready for decommissioning. He had no regrets and no unfinished business. The dandy sheriff of Apache County was ready to vanish into the red dirt of Arizona, leaving behind a legacy of blood and order that would never be forgotten. May 28, 1919. The dry, high-altitude air of Seligman, Arizona carried the scent of grease and coal smoke from the nearby railway yards into the quiet bedroom where Commodore Perry Owens faced the final cessation of his internal biological systems. At 66 years of age, the former lawman occupied a physical state defined by the advanced stages of Bright's disease, a chronic inflammation of the kidneys that had systematically compromised his physiology. His skin had acquired a translucent yellowish hue, stretched tight over a skeletal facial structure that still retained the sharp, hawk-like features of his youth. The edema in his lower extremities had progressed to a point where his legs were unrecognizable, the heavy swelling preventing any possibility of movement or the wearing of the high-topped boots that had been his signature. He lay beneath a single linen sheet, his breathing a shallow rhythmic rasp that punctuated the silence of the house, while the relentless Arizona sun beat against the wooden siding of the structure. The internal reality of the uremia had created a state of toxic accumulation within his bloodstream, leading to frequent periods of mental fog and intense physical nausea. Commodore processed these final sensations with the same mechanical detachment he had applied to the tracking of outlaws in the Mogollon Rim. He did not seek the comfort of prayer or the distraction of conversation, preferring to observe the gradual failure of his organs as a series of technical data points. His pulse was a thready, erratic vibration at his wrist, a mechanical clock that was rapidly losing its tension. Elizabeth remained at his side, her presence a silent, functional anchor in a room that smelled of carbolic acid and the metallic tang of unwashed steel. She managed the administration of water to his parched lips, though his throat had constricted to a point where swallowing was an act of extreme exertion. Even in this terminal condition, the dandy persona remained a functional requirement of his environment. He had insisted that Elizabeth brush his long white hair until it lay in a smooth, organized mane across the pillow. He refused to be seen in a state of disarray, viewing the maintenance of his appearance as his final duty to the office he had once held. His silver-plated revolvers sat on the bedside table, their walnut grips worn smooth by decades of contact with his palms. He no longer possessed the strength to lift them, but their proximity provided a sensory link to the era of his primary significance. He was a man who had lived by the gun and the ledger, and he intended to exit the world with both instruments within his reach. The significance of Commodore Perry Owens to the development of the American West resided in his ability to act as a terminal instrument of the law. He had entered the Arizona Territory at a moment when the social structure was a vacuum, filled by the predatory impulses of the Cooper-Blevins gang and the violent chaos of the Pleasant Valley War. His actions in Holbrook had not merely been a service of warrants. They had been a physical dismantling of the belief that the outlaw could operate with a superior force to the state. By standing alone against a house full of armed men and achieving a total neutralization of the threat in less than 3 minutes, he had established a new psychological reality for the territory. He had proven that a single disciplined individual backed by the authority of the badge was more lethal than any collection of disorganized criminals. This shift in the power dynamic had facilitated the rapid expansion of the cattle industry and the stabilization of the railroad networks. The investors in the East and the settlers from the Midwest were willing to commit their resources to Arizona because men like Owens had cleared the landscape of its human predators. He had been the necessary bloody bridge between the era of the individual gunfighter and the era of the institutionalized state. His legacy was written in the absence of the violence that had previously defined Apache County. He had transformed a war zone into a jurisdiction, a feat accomplished through the cold application of 4440 projectiles and a refusal to engage in the negotiations that had compromised his predecessors. He was the personification of a law that did not blink and did not miss. The town of Seligman had grown into a modern community during his years of residence, its boardwalks now crowded with people who had no memory of the dust and blood of the 1880s. To these residents, the dying man in the house on the hill was a ghost of a vanished world. They respected the peace he had provided, but found the mechanical coldness of his personality to be a source of persistent unease. Owens had never sought their affection, and in his final hours he felt no need for their company. He was a man of a different epoch, one where the boundaries of life and death were decided in seconds on a porch or in a canyon. He viewed the modern world of automobiles and telegraphs as a sanitized result of his own brutal labors, a world that he had made possible but in which he no longer had a functional role. As the afternoon progressed toward 5 o'clock, the symptoms of the uremic poisoning began to manifest in a series of muscular tremors and a deepening of the respiratory labor. The toxins in his blood were beginning to affect the neural pathways of his brain, creating a flickering of consciousness that he fought with a grim, stoic intensity. He watched the shadows of the window frame move across the floorboards, calculating the rotation of the earth by the speed of the darkening wood. He felt the coldness creeping into his fingers and toes, a sensory withdrawal that mirrored the cooling of a rifle barrel after a long engagement. He did not struggle against the process. He allowed the mechanical failure to proceed according to its own laws, his mind remaining a silent observer until the final connection was severed. Elizabeth observed the change in his breathing, the intervals between inhalations growing longer and more erratic. She did not cry out or attempt to restart the failing machine of his heart. She understood that Commodore would view such actions as an indignity, a violation of the orderly conclusion he had planned. She sat in the darkening room, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder, acknowledging the departure of the man who had been the most consistent force in her life. The silence of the house was absolute, save for the distant whistle of a westward-bound freight train, a sound that symbolized the modern Arizona that Owens had helped to forge. The train carried the commerce of a nation across a landscape that was now safe for the transit of wealth and people. The mechanical stop occurred at approximately 6:30 in the evening. The last breath was a thin, dry sigh that left his lungs and did not return. The heart, which had endured the stresses of Tennessee farms, Indiana woods, and Arizona shootouts, gave a final fluttering contraction and then became still. Commodore Perry Owens was dead, his physical remains a discarded shell of bone and pale skin. The uremia had finished its work, but it had only succeeded once there was nothing left for the man's will to command. He had remained conscious and focused until the final minute, a feat of discipline that was consistent with every other act of his life. The dandy sheriff had completed his final watch, his ledger now permanently closed. The news of his death was telegraphed to Holbrook, St. John's, and the territorial capital, triggering a final wave of reflection across the state. The newspapers carried the announcement in somber, factual columns, listing his achievements and the details of his most famous engagement. They spoke of him as a man of unflinching courage and unmatched skill. Yet the literal reality of his life was more complex than these adjectives allowed. He had been a man of singular, often atrocious violence when the law demanded it. He had shot a 15-year-old boy in the chest because the boy held a gun, and he had hunted men through the mountains with the same lack of emotion as if he were hunting buffalo. His significance lay in the fact that he was a man who did exactly what was necessary to achieve the desired result, regardless of the human cost. The burial took place 2 days later in the Seligman Cemetery, a location defined by the stark beauty of the basalt ridges and the relentless sweep of the wind. A small group of former lawmen and citizens gathered to pay their respects, their boots crunching on the volcanic grit of the burial ground. There were no long eulogies or poetic tributes. The men who knew Owens understood that such things would have been offensive to his nature. They stood in silence as the coffin was lowered into the earth, the red dirt of Arizona waiting to claim the man who had spent his life defending its integrity. The silver-plated revolvers were not buried with him. They remained with Elizabeth, a legacy of the steel and walnut that had been his only true companions. The impact of Commodore Perry Owens on the history of the Old West cannot be measured in the number of men he killed, but in the nature of the peace he established. He was the catalyst for the professionalization of law enforcement in the Southwest. Before him, the sheriff was often a political appointee who avoided conflict or took sides in local feuds. Owens demonstrated that a sheriff could be a neutral, lethal technician who served the warrant regardless of the political or social standing of the suspect. He removed the element of gambling from the service of the law. If Owens came for a man, that man was either going to jail or to the morgue. This certainty was the foundation of the civil society that followed him, a society that no longer required its citizens to carry rifles to the general store. In the years following his death, the physical environment of Apache County continued to change. The Blevins house in Holbrook was eventually removed to make way for new construction, and the watering hole at Navajo Springs was integrated into a larger ranching operation. The scars on the landscape were healed by time and the encroaching modern world, yet the stories of the dandy sheriff remained a vital part of the regional identity. He was the figure that tourists asked about when they stepped off the train, and he was the man that the old-timers remembered when they spoke of the days before the fences. He had become a part of the geology of the territory, a layer of history as hard and enduring as the rim itself. The grit and brutality of his life were the necessary ingredients for the refinement of the future. The violence he visited upon the rustlers and the bullies was a purifying fire that allowed for the growth of a more stable culture. He had lived a life devoid of poetry and metaphor, a life of literal distances and mechanical certainties. He had seen the blood on the porch and the smoke on the horizon, and he had never flinched from the reality of either. He was a human tool, shaped by the harsh conditions of his youth and tempered by the violence of his profession. When the tool was no longer needed, it was set aside, but its impact remained in the precision of the work it had performed. Elizabeth lived for several years after his passing, maintaining the home and the legacy of her husband with a quiet dignity. She rarely spoke of him to strangers, but she kept his image in her mind as he had been in his prime. Long-haired, impeccably dressed, and possessed of a gaze that could stop a man in his tracks. She knew that the world would never see another man like Commodore Perry Owens, for the world that had created him no longer existed. The frontier had been closed, the outlaws had been buried, and the law was now a matter of books rather than bullets. She was the final witness to the humanized reality of the man who had been the Iron Man of the high desert. As the decade of the 1920s began, the memory of the shootout in Holbrook transitioned from a living memory to a historical fact. The exact details of the mechanical sequence, the 4 shots, the 4 hits, the 3 deaths, became the standard against which all other frontier engagements were measured. Historians studied the ballistics and the topography of the event, seeking to understand how a single man could have achieved such a decisive result. They found the answer in the character of Owens himself, a man who did not experience fear or hesitation because he viewed combat as a technical problem to be solved through the application of known principles. He was the first modern lawman in a world that was still struggling to leave the medieval behind. The physical reality of the Seligman Cemetery remains a testament to the solitude of his life. His grave is marked by a simple stone, a modest monument in a landscape that offers no shelter. The wind continues to blow over the ridges, carrying the dust of the desert and the sound of the passing trains. Commodore Perry Owens lies in the earth he defended, his long hair and silver revolvers now part of the chemical composition of the Arizona soil. He is a silent participant in the ongoing history of the West, a figure whose significance is measured in the peace of the towns and the security of the roads. He was the dandy who took on a house full of outlaws alone, and in doing so he ensured that no one would ever have to do it again. The historical context of his death, occurring just as the world was emerging from the horrors of the Great War, emphasized the shift in the nature of violence. The individual gunfighter's skill was a relic of a time when the world was small enough for one man to change its course. Commodore had been one of the last of these individuals, a man who possessed the agency to alter the geography of a county with a single afternoon's work. As the 20th century accelerated into a future of mass movements and industrial slaughter, the story of Owens remained a compelling reminder of the power of individual discipline. He had been a man of his time, and he had performed his function with a level of perfection that defied the chaos of his environment. The final paragraph of the story of Commodore Perry Owens is one of absolute silence. The room in Seligman grew cold as the sun dipped below the horizon on that May evening in 1919. The doctors and the undertakers arrived to perform their necessary tasks, their movements hushed by the presence of the legend. They handled the body with a professional care, noting the scars and the physical toll of the disease. They prepared him for the burial, ensuring that he looked as he had always wished to be seen, clean, organized, and unyielding. The dandy sheriff was ready for the earth, and the earth was ready for him. The narrative had reached its final period, and the West was a different place because he had walked upon it. The significance of his standout actions, from the lonely vigils at Navajo Springs to the bloody porch in Holbrook, created a mental imagery that would endure for generations. He was the man with the Winchester and the long hair, the lawman who looked like a dandy but acted like a machine. He had humanized the law by being its most terminal and efficient practitioner. He had changed the Old West by removing the elements that prevented its growth, leaving behind a cleared field for the future to occupy. His death was not a tragedy but a completion, the final mechanical stop of a system that had fulfilled its design. Commodore Perry Owens was the law, and the law had finally found its rest in the quiet dirt of Seligman.